Baby, how you feeling? Head toss, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Woo, child, tired of the foolish. Gone, dust your shoulders off. Keep it moving, yes, Lord. Step into some new kicks. In there, swimwear, going to the pool quick. Come now, come dry your eyes. You know you a star, you can touch the sky. I know that it's hard, but you have to try. If you need advice, let me simplify. If he don't love you anymore, just walk your fine self out the door. I do my head talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Head talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Feeling good as hell. Baby, how you feeling? Woo, girl, need to kick off your shoes. Gotta take a deep breath, time to focus on you. All the big fights, long nights that you've been through. I got a bottle of tequila I've been saving for you. Boss up and change your life. You can have it all, no sacrifice. I know we did you wrong, we can make it right. So go and let it all hang out tonight. Cause we don't love you anymore. So walk your fine self out the door. And do your head talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling?
Good morning and welcome to NOW's 2021 Racial Justice Summit. I'm Christian Nunes, president of NOW, and we are so pleased to have you here today, along with our distinguished guests and panelists. Last year, we were able to gather in person on Capitol Hill. And while we can't be here together physically this time, we are very grateful for the opportunity to gather virtually. Now, to get things started, we are very pleased and honored to bring to you our very featured keynote and guest speaker, Congresswoman Robin Kelly. Congresswoman Robin Kelly was elected to serve the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois in 2013, where she worked to expand economic opportunity, reduce health disparities, and end gun violence. A staunch champion of common sense gun reform and responsible community policing, she authored the first ever congressional analysis of national gun violence epidemic, offering a blueprint for ending the crisis. She is the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust and co-chairs the Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls. Prior to her election to Congress, Kelly was a member of the Illinois House of Representatives. Please help me welcome Congressional member Robin Kelly as she comes to us as our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, and good morning. I am Congresswoman Robin Kelly, and I proudly represent the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois. I do serve on the House and Energy Commerce Committee, just elected vice chair of that very auspicious House committee, but I also serve on the Health Subcommittee. As was said, I'm also the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust. And once, I have to reflect on this, a very proud member of the Peoria Planned Parenthood. I was a board member. It's great to be here with hardworking, committed women and men who support reproductive rights. Because of your hard work, we retook the White House, the Senate, and elected a pro-choice majority in the House. So thank you all so very much. And we arrived at a critical moment when reproductive rights have never been more at risk. This year marks 48 years since Roe v. Wade was established the legal right to abortion. Yet today, nearly a half century later, abortion access is out of reach for many women, across the country. Since 2011, more than 480 abortion restrictions have been enacted in states across the country, making abortion inaccessible for people with low incomes and especially Black and brown people. Politicians should not be able to deny people the care they need just because of who they are, where they live, or how much they earn. Since 1976, Congress has used the Hyde Amendment to deny insurance coverage of abortion services for people working to make ends meet. And in the last 10 years, anti-abortion politicians have passed hundreds of laws to shut down clinics and make it harder to provide care. These policies mostly harm communities who are already treated unjustly by our healthcare system, especially Black and brown women. When a woman wants to get an abortion but is denied, she more likely is to fall into poverty. Restricting Medicaid coverage of abortion forces 1 in 4 poor women seek an abortion to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term. Access to abortion is being threatened like never before. The barriers to abortion care are increased by systemic racism, economic insecurity, and immigration status. Despite our wins in the legislative and executive branches, we've never been at a more dangerous crossroads with 3 Trump nominees confirmed to the Supreme Court. About 19 abortion cases are only a step away from being heard by the Supreme Court. The threat of Roe being overturned or gutted is very real. If the Supreme Court is working to undermine reproductive rights, then the legislature must act. I, along with my colleagues in Congress, are committed to ending the Hyde Amendment in the federal spending bill, and I am encouraged the Biden administration will work right alongside with us. We're working to create a future where women are able to make decisions about our health and our future with dignity and respect. We cannot go backwards. Leaving the vital decisions of health and family to the precarious balance of the court creates instability for thousands of American families. Our reproductive rights cannot depend solely on the next Supreme Court appointment. I support legislation that codifies fundamental reproductive rights and protects these rights from erosions by the courts. It's entirely too risky to leave women's access to comprehensive health care up to the whims of this Supreme Court or what might be future Supreme Courts. And I do this and say this and feel this with my own mother in mind, who, when she was very young, had to get an abortion, and it was a backroom abortion. And I never want to see things like that happen again. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your advocacy. Please know that your work is sorely needed, and we need your voices in every level of government. So thank you so much again, and good luck.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Kelly, for those thought-provoking words and that commitment that you have demonstrated to women and girls, and just the intersectional demonstration you've shown in the legislation that you're passing. We thank you for your time today and coming out on your busy schedule.
Thank you.
Thank you. So today's event, we are super excited because we really are talking about the intersects of gender, health, technology, violence, and race. Racial justice is an issue for everyone. Our panels will offer thought-provoking discussions that seek to answer some of the most pressing questions and challenging questions facing our society. They will also raise new questions and discussions about how to move forward in a deeply divided country where racist rhetoric has become normalized and violence and hate are displayed on our phones and TV screens daily. So we really want to make sure that we are taking our time now to really address these issues. Just last month, at the same site where we held our last Racial Justice Summit 1 year ago, Confederate flags were paraded around through the halls of Congress as violent and racist insurrectionists tried to destroy our democracy. And even though those images were terrifying, and even knowing all of the many challenges that face our journey to a more just society, you must never stop our efforts to forward the mission of racial equality. Now is committed to identifying and combating the barriers to equality and justice imposed by structural racism, particularly those that inflict a double burden of race and sex, discrimination on BIPOC, Latinx women and girls, including trans women and girls. We champion equal opportunities in all areas, including employment, education, and reproductive rights. This work is more important than ever. For the past year, our country has suffered from the crisscrossing pandemics of COVID-19, racial and economic injustice, and we must build a truly intersectional future where our policy leaders are working to address the gender and racial inequities that, while certainly not new, have been exposed like never before during COVID. And shocking stories of violence against African Americans and communities of color by law enforcement continue to present themselves daily. Since the brutal murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other Black women and men at the hands of police violence and police, millions have taken to the streets to demand justice. The government, the media, and our society finally recognize that Black lives matter. As NOW's first Black president in 55 years, I have especially followed the Justice for Breonna Taylor movement. For far too long, Black women and girls have been made to feel devalued, silenced, and held to different standards. NOW believes that the life of Breonna Taylor and the lives of so many other Black women lost due to unjust systems matter, and we will not stop raising our voices till we see justice. And NOW we'll take a holistic approach to women's rights, and our advocacy is also conducted through an intersectional lens. In addition to the events today's summit, we engage in an extensive racial equity training for our board, our staff, and members, and advocate strongly for policies that advance racial justice throughout. This work goes beyond our founding, including making sure we have milestone legislative actions and achievements like the 1991 Civil Rights Act, and our efforts for more recent George Floyd justice in the Policing Act and the Black Maternal Health Monuments Bill. Legislation has to include a racial justice framework. For now, intersectional feminism means that every piece of legislation, policy, or program we support must address marginalized and under-resourced populations, including BIPOC, LGBTQIA+ communities, and it is at our core of what we are as an organization. I want to say that again, is at the core of what we are as an organization. Today, we offer 4 exciting sessions with remarkable speakers and panelists who will engage in a discussion about racialized policy in the US. The summit's first panel will focus on the current polarized political landscape, and what it means for the right for reproductive justice. The second panel will unpack the history of our current criminal justice system, the campaign against police brutality, and what we can do to implement reform. The third panel will move to technology, addressing the digital inequities, and oppression, and what they mean for the future of ethical technology. And we will wrap up the summit with a discussion of democratic systems and institutions and how we can reframe our discourse to ensure that the voices of marginalized communities are amplified and elevated in our discussions of rebuilding democracy. Once again, on behalf of NOW's board and staff, I welcome you here today, and we look forward to a robust discussion and to engage you with thought throughout the day for this event. And now I'm very pleased to take you to our first moderator, the wonderful Dr. Anika Molzak, who will start off moderating our first panel discussion. Dr. Anika Molzak.
Thank you so much, Christian. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's going to be an amazing day of conversation, and I think it's going to be worth your while. So grateful for being invited to speak with you all today and to get our panel started. I want to also say thank you to Representative Kelly for your commitment to reproductive justice and equality. We are so fortunate to have you on the front lines of this battle. The fact is really that reproductive rights have been under attack for decades now. And conservative strategic efforts to overtake legislatures and institute burdensome and somewhat unnecessary regulations on reproductive health care has really resulted in access inequities, right, vastly across the country. And these restrictions are often exacerbated when we have economic inequities laid on top of it. So I'm thrilled for this panel and all that's going to come out of it. As I said, it's been said before, my name is Dr. Anika Molzak. I am the creator and founder of Race Positive LLC, which really is a consulting firm around talking about race and race relations. And it's my pleasure to just be here today to moderate this panel as well as the one that comes right after. And as Christian said, our first panel is all about discussing the current politicization and polarization, really, of what it means to fight for reproductive justice. Our speakers will provide insight and opportunities for how we can get involved in that fight for reproductive justice, and I would like to introduce them all to you. Our first one is Michelle Batchelor. Michelle is Vice President of the Government Affairs in Our Own Voice. Black women's reproductive justice agenda. She is responsible for developing, promoting, and partnering with reproductive justice organizations to advance a strategic policy agenda supporting Black women's access to safe abortions, contraceptions, and comprehensive sex education. Previously, she oversaw the domestic and global programming at the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors, including a focus on Black African Americans, youth, and women's HIV health portfolios. Michelle also worked at the Chicago Department of Public Health for 10 years, managing several programs across the STD, HIV, AIDS, substance abuse, and mental health divisions. Welcome, Michelle. Our second panelist is Yasmin Rady. Yasmin serves as National Political Director at Planned Parenthood Action Fund, where she oversees the organization's federal candidate endorsements, PAC activities, national political partnerships, and coordinated campaign efforts. She previously served as the Director of Organizing and Training at PPAF and Planned Parenthood Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She is also the co-founder of Resistance School, a free online practical training program. She previously served as Outreach and Field Director for the National Iranian American Council and as a 2008 Obama campaign in Ohio, as well as for the 2008 Obama campaign in Ohio. Sorry, Yasmin, I completely butchered the end of that, but I really hope that you give me some grace there. And the last person on our panel that I'd love to introduce is Gabby Garcia Vera. Gabby is the state's program manager for Catholics for Choice, working to advance the moral, ethical, and religious case for protecting reproductive health rights and justice as a Catholic value. For nearly a decade, Gabby has been part of the leadership team for Union Fuerza Latinx Institute, a one-day convening aimed at bringing queer and trans Latinx organizers from around the country together to help advance their leadership in fundraising, campaigns, and culture shift work. Previously, Gabby co-founded the Gokwi, I hope I said that right, Gokwi Language Collective, as Executive Director of Get Equal and the Florida Field Advocacy Manager for the Latin Institute. Let's welcome all of our panelists. So thrilled to have you here. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm just gonna run right into it. My first question is for you, Yasmin. These last 4 years under the Trump era, we've really seen just an incredible setback in the reproductive rights movement. And we've seen those rights attacked from the state level all the way up to the highest court in the land. Even though we elected a pro-choice candidate to the White House now, we still have lost a lot of key allies in districts all across the country. Can you give us perhaps just a bit of a rundown on what this past election means in the fight for reproductive rights?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you so much, Dr. Molzak, and thank you to the NOW team. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. So first off, I think your framing was perfect, Doctor, around we're in kind of a twin set of realities of a lot of setbacks, but also so much hope and opportunity. I wanted to start off by just saying something that we often don't give ourselves credit for as a reproductive freedom movement, which is our issue is popular. It is extremely popular with the American people. So a record 77% of Americans say they do not want to see Roe be overturned. And also, as we saw an onslaught of abortion bans all across the country this past year, and talk more about a few that we're seeing now. There was not a single state, even the reddest states in the country, not one state in the whole country where banning abortion was popular. And so I wanted to start off before diving into the election, just naming that because, our elections, we have a lot more work to do. We have some great things to celebrate, but also public support is on our side. And it's just about organizing to make sure that we are electoralizing that support effectively. So as Dr. Molzak said, and as Congresswoman Kelly mentioned in her opening, we are very, very excited that we have a pro-reproductive freedom trifecta in that we have a commitment from the highest office in the land to repeal the Hyde Amendment. And we have our first Black woman VP who has been singing from that songbook since before she was even in the Senate. We also have a fragile but important House majority, as the House majority, of course, was what saved us from unbelievable possible damage during the Trump administration, and we've held that majority, although more fragile than we'd like. Something that I did not expect for us to have is that we won the Senate, and thank goodness that we did. And just, for every single organizer who is active in Georgia, what a blessing we have that we now have the Senate thanks to that win. And I wanted to just, I know everyone followed the Georgia Senate race really closely, but I wanted to also shout out that in Reverend Raphael Warnock, we don't just have an ally of reproductive freedom. We have someone whose first job out of college was as a sex educator, someone who self-identifies as a pro-choice pastor, and who really actually understands the principles of reproductive justice and understands the reproductive justice movement as a movement founded by and led by Black women, women of color. So it's just, we're in a very different reality in the federal landscape than what we could have really imagined just a few years ago. And that is really exciting. And it means we have a mandate to repeal the Hyde Amendment. And I'm really, really excited for Michelle to talk about the incredible work that reproductive justice partners, our organizations, are doing to drive that fight, and for all of us to be supportive of it. So a lot to be hopeful for, but fragile hope in the Senate. And then, I think that I say it's fragile because we have to do a lot of organizing and a lot of push and accountability to make sure that that trifecta lives up to its promise, and that we've only got really 2 years to get a lot of work done before another election is right around the corner. Redistricting is on the horizon. And so we've got to be organizing in the states where maps are being redrawn, as those will have a really big impact on our ability to hold the House in 2022. And then, of course, we have to be really successful and show supporters of reproductive freedom around the country that this government has fought for them, because we have to hold the House and hold the Senate in 2022 in order to have 2 more years of work to do before we win again in 2024. So again, hopeful but fragile in the federal landscape. And in the states, I think things are a darker story, which is going to require a lot deeper organizing from all of us. I think many of the folks here know, because you're involved in these fights, that in 29 states, anti-abortion politicians hold the majority in state legislatures. That is 29 states too many, and that's a lot of work that we need to do to fix. And just in this past, since state legislative sessions have started, more than 150 anti-abortion bills have been introduced or filed, 40% of which are abortion bans. So these are just numbers that should all be zero. And the fact that we are continuing to have these onslaughts of attacks at the state level is the pipeline for how we have ridiculous bills being brought up at the federal level. And quite frankly, the states are the biggest barriers to where, even with Roe as the law of the land, you all know that so much of our, people's access to reproductive health care comes from state bans. So we have a lot of work to do to elect great people in the states. That's going to require all hands on deck. And then I guess I'll just close by saying, when we do win and we elect people like Congresswoman Kelly, and we elect great folks in our states, we see just how much that transforms the healthcare landscape. So 1/4 of proactive abortion policies passed since Roe versus Wade were just enacted last year. So 1/4 of the history since Roe versus Wade of proactive work is just very, very recent. And we've got a mandate to make sure that that keeps happening in 2022 and beyond. So with that, I will turn to my colleagues to share their thoughts as well.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was great. And, I think that you teed us up beautifully for my next question, which goes to Michelle, and talking about the disproportionate impact, right, of the attacks on reproductive health care. And so, Michelle, of course, Black people and many other people of color, low-income people, queer, trans people have particularly been affected by the damage done to the reproductive rights in this country. Can you talk to us a little bit about why reproductive justice needs to be at the center of our movement, and what does reproductive justice even mean from a public health perspective?
Hi, thank you, Dr. Molzak. Thank you all for having me, Christian. Now, I really appreciate it. I feel honored to be able to have this discussion with Yasmin and Gabby in particular, who I fan from afar. So Dr. Mozak, to answer your question, I'm probably a little bit biased, but I do think reproductive justice needs to be at the center of all our movement activities, because it really is grounded in human rights. And I have to guess, probably everyone attending this cares about human rights, and we see the humanity in folks, and that really is what reproductive justice is about. And I always like to provide kind of the history of it, because that really does kind of ground it. But reproductive justice is a framework that was founded by 12 Black women in 1994. They were in Chicago attending a conference, a pro-choice alliance conference with the Miss Foundation for Women. And the goal of that conference was to create a collective response to the Clinton administration's proposed plan for universal health care. And that also coincided with the conference that these women attended in Cairo that was hosted by the International Conference on Population and Development, where they reached the conclusion that individual rights to plan one's own family must be central to global development. And so these 12 Black women, who at the time called themselves the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, coined this phrase and developed the term because they felt that women, that had limited income, women of color, LGBTQ people, including transgender in particular, non-binary and non-gender conforming individuals, felt neglected and misrepresented by what was at the time the women's rights movement, which had primarily focused on abortion rights as solely a white women's issue. The term really is a combination of reproductive rights and social justice, and that's pretty key to everything that we do, because it acknowledges that a pregnant person cannot freely choose what to do with the pregnancy when options are limited by oppressive circumstances and lack of access to services. So reproductive justice, as it's defined, is the human right to control our bodies, our sexuality, our gender, our work, and our reproduction. And so that right can only be achieved when all marginalized communities have complete economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, our families, our communities, in all areas of our lives. And so that includes the right to choose if, when, and how to start a family. So I do like to provide that framing. I know that's not new probably to a lot of people that are participating today, but it can get a little confusing. And I do like to really emphasize that this was started by Black women in particular that really wanted to speak to the needs of marginalized communities. And it really does cover a lot of issues, which I think is somewhat challenging for folks in a lot of the spaces, because it is economic justice, it's environmental justice, it's voting rights, and health equity. And those all do relate to reproductive health and rights. The reproductive frame focuses on more than just the rights. It's asserting the legal rights to abortion is meaningless, though, if we can't access those services. And we know that all these other issues get in the way of people accessing those services. And so everything like Yasmin was just talking about, these restrictions that, put, costs out of, make it economically not accessible for people to access contraceptives, abortions, even, our well women visits, the distance that people have to travel. I think, last year, some states, people had to travel 150 miles to reach a reproductive health care provider. And then you take into the things, so you have to travel 150 miles. That means you have to take time off work. You have to find childcare services, depending on whether there's a waiting period or, some other barrier that's been constructed, you will have to find a place to stay so that you can come back for the follow-up visit. All of these things are unnecessary and put barriers that we know, and I think Congresswoman Kelly and Yasmin have spoken about, Christian spoke about, is, primarily affecting Black and Brown people, and so, there are currently more than 100 bills that are restricting voting rights that are currently moving through state legislatures. We continue to see states introduce more and more restrictive barriers to accessing reproductive health care. I mean, just this week, South Carolina passed the first abortion ban of 2021 that would ban abortion at 6 weeks of pregnancy. Most people don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks, and a lawsuit has been filed in that. But also you look at minimum wage, I forget who mentioned it, but, with the reconciliation that's happening right now for COVID relief, they're fighting over increasing the minimum wage from $7.25. That is not a livable wage. $15 isn't a livable wage in a lot of places, but it would help. And so all of these restrictions on abortion, restrictions on voting, pay equity, those are just examples of the issues that impact and are addressed through the reproductive justice frame, because they adversely impact particularly Black, Brown, marginalized communities. And as we see right now, the country really is finally, hopefully, coming to terms with racism and the need, and how our policies and our systems maintain white supremacy. And it's pervasive in our policies and our practices. And so, in talking about public health, several states have started to declare that racism is a public health issue. That is a step in the right direction. And so it creates an opportunity for the public health field to take their knowledge and their concern for protecting the health of people and communities and combine those with like the RJ frame, the systems with the human rights and social justice frame, to somewhat ensure that conditions are conducive for all people to do well and to be healthy and to prevent disparities. I've worked in public health for many years, so I know that's easier said than done. We've been talking about health disparities and community engagement for years, and yet they still persist. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in our strategic planning meetings and community engagement is front and center, and yet we still struggle for how to do that and not tokenize individuals. So I do think the reproductive frame provides that opportunity to rethink how we view individuals and communities, how we talk about the issues, who's included at the table, and how decisions are made. And so I'll end by saying, reproductive justice really centers that no one lives a single issue life. And so to protect the public's health and prevent illness, there has to be a consideration for all the factors, seen, unseen, policy systems that influence perceived risk, healthy decision-making. And so the systems and the policies that have oppressed and controlled, particularly Black and Brown bodies, we've got to really continue to have these very uncomfortable conversations. There is no public health policy and program decisions that should be made without community input. Every effort has to be made to engage and include Black and Brown people, but I'll end by saying there should be no engagement that should happen without compensation for those people's time, their expertise, their skills, their insights, because no more free labor by Black and Brown people. We deserve to be compensated just like everyone else. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michelle. And I appreciate just sort of that reminder that no person is sort of existing in a vacuum. Like, we are made up of so much more. And when we think about this stuff, we can't just think of it as a one issue piece. And that leads us right to Gabby, where we think about faith, right? And the faith community has a huge role to play in how we move forward with this. And so, Gabby, oftentimes when we think about religious groups, we think of them as being against reproductive healthcare access. Can you, tell us perhaps from a religious standpoint, explain why Catholics for Choice supports reproductive rights and how this religious sort of dimension would connect to the reproductive rights from a racial justice lens?
And thank you, everyone, for being here today. And thank you to my co-panelists and to our moderator. I'm super excited to be with everybody. My name is Gabi Garcia Vera. My pronouns are anything as long as it's said respectfully. And as has already been stated, I work at Catholics for Choice, which, much like probably many of the Latinx people that you know, are also Catholic. When we do something, we tend to roll deep. And I think the conversation about faith, we need to get like a little bit more nuanced and get a little bit more uncomfortable. When we talk about race and racism in this country, and Michelle talked about, racism is being declared like a public health crisis in some states. And yet at the same time, I think the needle that we want to thread and the needle that I oftentimes like hold with people is, words without changes in behaviors are simply manipulations. And I say that to frame really the discourse around what it means to be a person of faith. I think our opposition is clearly in like a faithful alignment in relationship. We know from like just being on the ground in states, right? Like the opposition is using religious dogma at every turn, right? And much like we have seen the right do, right, cares very little about whether, scripture says one thing here and another thing there. And honestly, I don't think that those are the helpful arguments to have. No one gets to have your faith because it doesn't fit in a nice, neat little box, right? Like I'm queer and I'm Catholic and I work in like the reproductive health rights and justice movement. Like, I'm sure when I walk into church, the priest is like, "Oh, aquí viene." But I think we have to really decenter who gets to be the moral arbiter of our lives. And oftentimes what we see in a lot of this conversation is that because our opinions don't fall in alignment, oftentimes in our experience, right, with the Catholic hierarchy, they are devalued, right? Like, and you know what? Like, people will try to discredit you. They will try to dehumanize you at every turn so that they can make okay when they do like real wild ass shit to you and like basically treat people like garbage, right? We know that the Catholic Church within itself is an institution that can change, right? Because we have seen them, in the 1960s, the Catholic Church, like the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, put out a statement saying that they disavowed racism, which great, but they were a little late on the uptake for any folks doing the math there. And, and I asked people, I'm like, do you believe our church to be a place that seeks to profit from war? And people are like, absolutely not. And I'm like, great. So explain to me the Crusades. So when we have conversations about what it means to be a faithful person, what is our moral obligation to ourselves and our own spiritual relationship and connection? Who gets to lead us, right? I think in the same way that we show up and we ask people when we're doing the work, around like advancing conversations just about race and racism, right? Because it's super complicated. We live in a society that is inherently built on the like foundation of racism and patriarchy. So to believe that anyone is absolved of it is, at least from my perspective, like not really doable because it permeates every single thing in our society. And so like once we understand that, shifting our conversation, shifting who becomes the moral arbiter, right? And meeting people where they're at, but also not letting it be okay to like devalue or dehumanize someone. Because I mean, I just think, the Jesus that I knew was like flipping tables and like hanging out with the people, probably at the bodega, if I'm being like 100. And I think the other thing that I think is really interesting, and I think oftentimes we use oppositional language a lot, and it's a thing that we really struggle with. But I also think we use really like, we show up into conversations with people and we don't do the legwork necessary to hold space with people. We ask like Black, Indigenous, people of color, like folks across the spectrum to sit and do labor with us and engage. And I think part of what we really have to hold is like our responsibility in showing up to that conversation. It's not enough that we just ask to be educated. We also have to like show up and have done some research. We have to show up and have done some work. We have to show up and like really consider in that conversation, like what does being an accomplice versus being an ally look like, right? How are people using all of their street cred, right, in their circles to amplify the work happening? Because I think, we talk about white supremacy as like the ideal for how we talk about, even in our grant writing, how we talk about harm, rather than, we say marginalized communities, people impacted by poverty, right? Like, why not say like communities subverting the impact of white supremacy and colonialism, right? Like, why do we frame things from an angle of oppression? Why do we talk about our liberation from oppression? And I think these are like all tipping points on how we really shift the narrative of like our own church, our institutions, right? Like the Catholic Church it's not the hierarchy, right? It's not the pews, it's not a book, it's the people. And I think similar could be said for any of our organizations. And so when people show up in those conversations, when we show up, and say like, oh yeah, we're going to change, but we don't follow that with impact or like with a plan or like concrete next steps. And I think like Michelle said, like when we show up and we ask people for free labor, which, ain't nobody got time for. Audacity is at an all-time high. We need to like stop. I think that reflects more on like that people haven't done the work to show up to that conversation yet.
Thank you so much, Gabby. I really appreciate you just sharing that. And I think you highlight some really important points, which is I think when the argument or the conversation is sort of framed from your opponent's perspective, it's very hard to win that argument, isn't it? And I think what you're calling us all to is to really just change the frame and take it out of this you versus me, but really come to the heart of the matter. Let's talk about what the facts are, and then from there we can find our way forward. So I really like that charge to all of us to reframe how we even start talking about this. As we conclude, with my questions, I wanted to just pose a question to everyone. For us to think about today. We talked a lot already about some of the damage that's been done, right, to reverse reproductive health rights across the country. But what can we do to progress? How do we make reproductive health even better than it's ever been in the United States from this point forward? And that's for everyone.
I'm happy to kick things off in part because I'm feeling very fired up on my fellow panelists. Just want to thank each of you for your reflections, and you have my creative juices flowing on the answer to this question. But I just wanted to, before answering directly, I think for me, the solution to all problems is organizing, and really deep organizing that is locally rooted and that is centering the people most impacted by an issue. And I think that's how we will win. And as Michelle was talking, and Michelle, by the way, I asked my colleagues who get to work more closely with Michelle any background, and they just said, honestly, she's just a delight, and you're going to see on this panel. And I feel like we just witnessed that. But I think we're experiencing not just major political challenges, but we are also, as my co-panelists have said, we're in twin pandemics, and in twin pandemics of a COVID pandemic and a moment of racial reckoning that is rooted on the pandemic of racism. The solutions are organizing, but they're also following the leadership of leaders who have really been deeply rooted in communities, who understand how intersectional solutions are. As Michelle said, people don't live single issue lives. They're also not single issue solutions. And in order to come out on the other end of this moment, we've got to be following the leadership of the organizers and the leaders who have brought that intersectional approach. In the repro space, that's RJ leaders. I mean, it's RJ reproductive justice leaders have been without enough credit leading that charge, and I think it is long overdue time to follow that leadership. So I think that's at a high level, and then I think that if organizing is the solution for how we get through it, I think it also ought to be values-based organizing. And so I really appreciated, Gabby. It's such a treat to meet you. I wish we were in person to get to meet you in person, but I just think the work that Catholics for Choice is doing, and also that all organizers are doing to center the values that call us into this work. I mean, none of us do this, for the paycheck. None of us do this for the whatever. We do this because we're called to it. And for so many of us, that comes from our values. And as Gabby, you were talking, it reminded me, I used to do congregation-based organizing, and one of the pastors I used to work with used to always bring up, whenever we would kind of be knocking our heads against the wall about how faith is just brought out as a conservative value rather than a value that motivates folks on the left as well. He said that there's a difference between tradition and traditionalism. Tradition is the living ideas of the dead, and traditionalism is the dead ideas of the living. And often we are talking about values work through the lens of traditionalism rather than tradition, of whether that's through Catholicism, whether that's through the traditions of what the amazing history that Michelle brought up of the reproductive justice movement that we can learn from, or whether it's our own family and cultural traditions. I think the way that we bring that into the organizing and the deep organizing, not like online just petition signing, deep organizing in communities, I think through that we will win elections, and we will also win the issue fights, because we've got a lot of friends to hold accountable to, and some are friends and some are folks in, all of us do nonpartisan, cross-partisan work. We've got work to do with the Democratic Party too. John Bel Edwards, governor of Louisiana, himself supports the 6-week ban that passed the legislature in Louisiana last year. So I say all that I think if we stick to organizing, we do that deep work, we elect the kind of people who center our issues, we center the people who are most impacted by these fights, which is unequivocally, it's people of color, Black and brown people, and low-income folks, who all of those healthcare disparities that Michelle talked about will not be able to be overcome if we are not centering the people who would be most impacted by something like an abortion ban in that political work.
I feel like mic drop, like Yasmin, you just said all the things. Yeah. Like, I don't even know where to add. Like, that was phenomenal framing. And Gabby, you have like, stretched my mind also to like rethink how I'm talking about the issues. I said in my comments, but I think there's always opportunity for growth. So I really appreciate both of you and what you said. And I was just, as you were talking, I was looking at one of the comments in the chat about, we can't depend on our elected officials. And, yes and no. I think we have to. This is the system we're in, and we have to hold them accountable. Because I think I agree with you, Yasmin. I think it is organizing. We've seen it. I mean, we have to. I can't be in a meeting and not mention Stacey Abrams. It's just like, has just shown us what we can do with just determination and following our gut, as someone said. And I think if we can't trust our elected officials, we need to get them out of there. We need to put people in place, and that might be us, not me, but it might be you all. It might be, it might be that the neighborhood. I remember when I was doing case management, and it was, finding the gatekeepers in the community and they may not have that, you know, pedigree, but damn it, they're not some of the smartest people and most insightful people I've ever met. Imagine if they would just get the support they need to be able to get the platform that we have for any number of reasons. And so I think, you know, Yasmin, I think you've said it all, but I add to that, you know, we have to hold our elected officials accountable. And if not, we got to get them out of there. And that's, I think we saw that a lot with Georgia, with Pennsylvania, Arizona, I think, you know, and I really hope that, you know, that energy stays in place. And I think even with the reframing of how we talk about things, again, why I really appreciate reproductive justice is because I don't think it, you know, everything is about my womb. I really don't. I think there's a lot more that we need to talk about so that we can improve all lives. And so I really want to hear what Gabby has to say. And I know, Dr. Mozak, you want us to move on, so I'm going to be quiet and let Gabby join in.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Michelle. And Gabby, before you share your thoughts with us, I just want to let everyone know that I'm sure you're also chomping at the bit to ask this amazing panel a bunch of questions as well. So while Gabby gives the answer, perhaps you can type your answers or your questions that you have for our panelists in the chat box. Please know that we have very little time left, but we'll do our very best to get to as many questions as possible. But Gabby, it's your turn. I don't know. You have the mic now, so it's no pressure.
So I think co-sign to everything that was said, and let me know where to sign up to, like, go phone bank, like call somebody, go hassle somebody. You know, I have a nice collection of bullhorns waiting, collecting dust. You know, I want to offer some, like, practical sort of tips to folks, because I think when I started to unpack my own journey around what showing up for racial justice looked like to me in the work, I really, like, I was struggling, right? I think like a lot of people, trying to inform yourself from because once you know something, once you know a truth, you can never unknow it, right? The question is, are you willing to do something about it? And so, like, the place in the lane in which I found myself was really organizing other people that looked like me, that sounded like me, right? Because I think everyone can attest that every couple of months on YouTube, like, pops up a video of, like, a Puerto Rican somewhere, like, yelling at someone something super racist, right? And, like, we don't just get to disown those people. Those are our people, right? Like, we have to be willing to come and gather our folks as much as we are willing to sit and be patient with folks, as much as we are willing to be tender with them. And I think when we think about the work long term, I really challenge people, you know, what are things that you can actively be doing to organize conversations with people that look like you and sound like you, to help do the work around racial justice, whether it's, like, in your family, whether it's in your place of worship, right? Because we know that sometimes the leaders in our in our religious institutions aren't actually holding the values that they claim, right? Like, they're picking and choosing, and it becomes very clear. And we have to hold those people accountable, right? I think we have lost so much already, and I think we do not need to rewrite history. We don't need to rethink it. And at the same time, we need to ask for, like, big, bold inspiration. Like, I'm tired of asking for breadcrumbs. You know what I mean? Like, people that run that strategy end up hungry. And, you know, I'm always in my kitchen. And so, like, everything is about food for me. And so I'm like, cool. So, like, how are we gonna feed the community, right? And as my sister says, you know, donde hay un plato, hay cuatro tenedores. And so, like, where there is one plate, there's always four forks. And we need to really think about how we amplify that strategy to our community in a way that makes it more accessible. Because I think we're leaving a lot of people behind just because we're not stopping to think or to hold space for them, or to even just build the container that, like, allows them to show up.
Thank you, Gabby. I really appreciate that perspective. So far, we don't have any questions in the chat box yet, but if you do have a question, please share it. But I have a question, and Gabby, that, the idea of, I have two questions, and I'm trying to figure out how can I merge them into one. But one question really would be, in lieu of the traditional way of framing the conversation around this stuff, what would you suggest would be a better way that we can frame it that would invite people who are opposing or who are left behind, as you just said, to be a little bit more engaged or at least open to the conversation?
I think when we think about how we show up to those conversations, right? Like ultimately, we can't have civil discourse if we are being like disrespectful. I think like there's something to be said about respectability politics that I think when we think about structurally inside of systems cause a lot of harm, mostly right to people that look like the folks on this panel, right? Everybody knows what it's like to be like, oh, you're kind of being a little too loud, or like you're too, like if you don't say anything, people are like, oh, okay, they're mad. If you say too much, people are like, oh, you've got a lot of feelings. I think when we think about how to frame conversations, I think we need to be okay with not having all the answers. I think there's a lot of people showing up, and I think the fear of getting it right is getting in the way of doing the work, right? Like show up and know that you don't know it all. Show up and say like, hey, I might fuck it up. And if I fuck it up, I'm going to do the work to like learn the things I don't know. I'm going to build for that, right? But like everyone's on a journey. And my mom voted for Trump in 2016. And we had at it in the car, and she basically burst into tears. And I was like, you don't get to cry. I was like, eso no vale. I was like, you don't get to cry. I was like, we can hold this as a complex thing, but we need to be willing, one, to admit the things that we don't know. We need to like show up with a little bit of tenderness and compassion for other people, which honestly, I don't know about y'all, but feels a little hard sometimes these days, especially after a year being bored in the house. And I think we just need to really be willing to come back to each new engagement with that person and say, you know what, I did a little bit of work. That thing that you said to me, I thought about it. And so like, I wanted to tell you, this is what I think, or like I went and I did some research. Imagine how much more powerful and productive our conversations would be if we showed up and said, hey, I was listening to you. And because I went and researched that thing that we were talking about because it mattered to me.
Great. I think that's such a good point. I think sometimes humility is often missing. Humility and grace, I think, are two words that are not often invited into these conversations. And if they were, I think a lot of things can change. And I often find, just in my own work as a psychologist, but also with my company, that when people are having these conversations, they're talking past each other. They're not even having the same conversation. And that's why there's no ability to even come to an agreement, because we weren't even talking about the same thing. One was talking economics, the other was talking about access, and it's just completely missing the mark. And so I agree, being willing to listen truly, understand, you don't have to agree, but understand where the other person's come from, what drives them, you're better able to make a case for why you think they are inaccurate and help them to see it. Now, we are not miracle workers. We can't make people do what they don't want to do, but we can at least create the opportunity for that conversation to be had. And so I think your advice and the advice of everyone else on this panel helps us to move forward, get active, and be educated about what you're talking about. Helps you to really be more effective in this fight. So thank you so much to our incredible panelists. You all know who have shown up today that reproductive rights is one of NOW's core issues, and we really want to just continue engaging around this topic in the year ahead. And your questions, if you have them, please, go ahead and send them. We'll figure out a way to get it to our panelists. But we're going to take about a 5-minute break now and regroup for our next panel that's going to be on police accountability. Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you to our amazing panelists. We so appreciate you.
Yes.
Thank you all so much.
all were amazing.
Are we open? Or we're not on the
Oh, we're
program?
still recording, but
Y'all are so good.
Oh my gosh. Can we do, Christian, can we do this every week? You're okay.
The other thing I've been doing with some of the folks, I'm in the Rockwood RJ cohort this year, and one of the things that we did is we made a playlist for the
he keeps on mute.
Yeah, I think they're putting us on mute.
All right, welcome back. We are so excited for our second panel for today. Once again, my name is Dr. Nika Molzak, and I am the creator and founder of Race Positive LLC, which is a consulting firm around helping people to talk about race in a way that's positive and engaging and actually productive. And today we'll be having our second panel, this time unpacking the history of the current criminal justice system, the campaign against police brutality, and what we can do to implement true reform. In 2020, I, along with I'm sure most of you, watched from our homes in quarantine, what was happening in many of the Black and Brown communities for years, or many people in those communities were fully aware of, and that is that justice in this country is not doled out equally. The defund the police hashtag became just a call for racial justice activists to really draw attention to the criminal justice reform and the advocates for change, right, to the budgetary priorities that will be the focus for a little bit more of social services that are available to those communities. Sadly, however, opponents of reform engage in what I think is rightly described as disinformation campaigns that led to a huge misunderstanding of the initiative and much debate around it. Our conversation today will be about unpacking the history of our current criminal justice system and what we can do, like I said before, to implement reform using a racial justice framework. I would first like to introduce our distinguished featured speaker, Congressman Bobby Scott. Congressman Scott has represented Virginia's 3rd Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives since 1993. Previously, he served in Virginia's state legislature, where his legislative successes included increasing Virginia's minimum wage and improving healthcare benefits. Representative Scott is the first African-American elected to Congress from Virginia since Reconstruction, which is a very long time. He currently serves as the chairman of the Committee on Education and Labor. He's also a leader on criminal justice reform, including co-authoring the recently enacted Safe, Accountable, Fair, and Effective Justice Act, widely recognized as one of the most comprehensive criminal justice reform bills ever. We're so pleased to welcome Congressman Scott.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank everyone for joining this webinar on racial justice. I'm pleased to join you today and note that we will hear from speakers on today's panel covering such important topics as reproductive justice, police accountability, the hidden bias in technology, and rebuilding our democracy. I don't have to remind anyone here that the pandemic has had a catastrophic impact on our society. Over 500,000 Americans have died, and we have record unemployment. This national crisis has laid bare the inequities in our country. Black and Hispanic populations are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 because they are more likely to be exposed to the virus due to inequities in terms of housing, transportation, occupation, and access to health care. And roughly 2 million women have left the workforce since 2019, in large part due to the pandemic. Thankfully, the Biden administration has prioritized ramping up vaccine distribution and has also unveiled a robust COVID-19 relief package, which will help our economy build back better. President Biden's relief package builds on the success of the CARES Act and the relief package that Congress passed at the end of last year. The pandemic has also placed a new focus on the importance of expanding health care. The Affordable Care Act has made affordable, comprehensive healthcare available to millions of Americans, and we must continue to build on that progress. The previous administration attempted to undermine that progress by attacking protections for contraceptive coverage and was a threat to the health and safety of women across the country. Additionally, some politicians have used freedom of religion as a tool to deny women access to health care. That is why I'm reintroducing the Do No Harm Act, which prevents the Religious Freedom Restoration Act from being misapplied to discriminate against individuals in the workplace, create barriers to contraception and abortion services, and treat members of the LGBTQ community unfairly. As chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, I'm also focused on boosting paychecks for working families. I was proud to introduce the Raise the Wage Act, which will gradually raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. I'm also working to increase protections for pregnant workers. and also to address the achievement gap for students of color who have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic and school closures. The pandemic has made everything difficult in the last year, but it has also exposed systemic problems in policing in America. In the coming month, we will reintroduce the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This bill was the culmination of years of work by the Congressional Black Caucus and addresses issues of police brutality, racial profiling, and legal barriers to justice. The bill also is a response to the millions of people who have made their voices heard on the issue of policing in America. During the presidential campaign, President Biden made some very important promises about criminal justice reform. He recognizes that the tough on crime policies of the 1980s, which were driven by slogans like 3 strikes and you're out, or if you do the adult crime, you do the adult time, made us a leader in mass incarceration, but did nothing to reduce crime. It's time we followed the evidence and research and enacted laws that create proportional punishment and help people re-enter society, help them get a good job, help them treat their addiction, and help them get the mental health care they need. That's why I'm reintroducing the Safe Justice Act. The Safe Justice Act is a comprehensive criminal justice reform bill aimed at reforming federal sentencing, curtailing overcriminalization, and reducing recidivism. The bill will reduce crime, save money, and provide reinvestment into communities devastated by mass incarceration. We are at a critical point in our society. We can create a country that is based on principles of freedom, fairness, and justice. But to achieve this goal, we must secure quality health care, economic security, and civil rights for all. To enact these principles into law, we must learn the lessons from the 2020 presidential election, and that is that elections matter. Voting matters. Electing qualified leaders who follow facts and evidence is what helped this country get through this toughest times. Vigilance and a commitment to peaceful political action is required to combat the lies and racial hatred that threaten our democracy. And I hope you will learn from the panelists today, but most of all, I hope you will feel empowered to take up the cause of racial justice and create a more just and equitable society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman Bobby Scott. We're so grateful for your words. Now, I'd like to turn to our panelists and introduce the amazing group that I have for you today. The first person I want to introduce you to is Sakira Cook. Sakira is the director of the Justice Reform Program of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Education Fund. The Leadership Conference is a coalition of more than 200 national organizations to promote and protect civil and human rights. Ms. Cook leads the development of the Justice Reform Programs to advance transformative policy solutions that eliminate structural inequity, racism, and injustice at every stage of the criminal legal system. Welcome, Sakira. Our second person is Stephanie Morales. In 2015, Stephanie became the first woman to be elected Commonwealth's attorney in Portsmouth, Virginia. She is committed to seeking restorative justice and correcting the wrongs to members of the community by the system. In 2015, she established the Control-Alt-Delete program to foster successful re-entry for the formerly incarcerated community, also known as returning citizens. Morales is an author with a new children's book called The Day I Became a Lawyer. Welcome to our panel, Stephanie.
Thank you.
And the third person we want to welcome is Hassan Ahmad. Hassan is the founder and principal of the HMA law firm. He built the firm on one simple idea: people need protection and perseverance to prosper. Under Hassan's leadership, legal knowledge and skill is leveraged to fight for clients' rights. Hassan is fluent or proficient in 8 languages, which is amazing, besides English, and has earned a reputation among his peers as the go-to attorney in matters of immigration law. He's also an immigrant right advocate. Welcome, Hassan. Thank you so much for being with all of us. Hopefully, Stephanie will be able to hop on and chat with us soon. But my first question goes to Sakira, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I hope it's not Sakira and I'm butchering it.
It's
It is, yay, wonderful. So, of course, at the front of all of our minds in these conversations are the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McClain. There's so many, unfortunately, within the Black community, and the mass movement for Black lives that has followed in the wake of these murders. What impact do you feel like this movement has had, and what progress, if any, do you feel has been made in the last 9 months?
So first I want to say thank you to the National Organization for Women for hosting this important conversation and inviting me here to speak to all of you. As was noted, I lead the Justice program at the Leadership Conference, and our coalition has been working on issues at the intersection of race and the criminal legal system for decades. And it is no surprise, I would say, that in the recent years, recent months also, we experience kind of an inflection point with the murders of a number of individuals, but I think the sort of spark was the murder of George Floyd, and the fact that it was captured on camera, and that it was so long that, he was being tortured with a knee to his neck by the police officer. And the nation was taken by storm. A series of protests throughout the summer and into the fall ensued. And what folks were, I think, calling our attention to, which has been the case for very, very long, is the fact that we actually have never reckoned with our history in this country. The history of enslavement, Jim Crow segregation, convict leasing, the structural racism and inequity that has basically been part and parcel of every system in this country has come to light, not only through the pandemic and the inequities that we see in healthcare, education, economic opportunity, the criminal legal system, but also, sort of how that intersects with anti-Black racism in America and the history of anti-Black racism in America. And so what you saw people, this movement rallying, I think, and it was so different, and I think it felt very different for people because it was so intersectional. It was so intergenerational. It was very diverse. And I think that is significant because it shows to some extent an awakening of people's minds and hearts to the fact that Black Americans, for the most part, and also Latino Americans and other people of color, have for too long, sort of been discriminated against and been subjugated in this country because of the presence of white supremacy and white nationalism, and how that intersects with every system that we have today. And that awakening, I think, is moving people to take action and to think about these issues very differently. And so I think in the last 9 months, we have seen not only protests, but protests be translated to action. And organizations like Black Lives Matter and the Movement for Black Lives, along with traditional civil rights organizations, were able to galvanize, the heart and the minds of people who were out in the streets almost every day and every week, and take them to the polls, right? And really make a huge statement that, we are done with white supremacy and white nationalists in this country. And not just individuals, but that the systems that uphold those constructs need to be torn down, need to be eradicated from our society. And we can't wait to do that anymore. And so I think, we are at a turning point in this country. And what we do, not only in the next 4 years, or even I would say in the next 18 months, will really set the stage for what happens in the future in this nation, and how we're able to fully, sort of no longer tinker around the edges, but lead and really sort of bring forth transformative change, right? And I was listening to the earlier panel where the person was talking about, asking for what you want, being bold and being visionary in your request, and not settling for the margins. And I think that's what we've seen. I think the impact of that movement has led people to say, no, no more. We are not going to accept sort of the crumbs that you are leaving for us and have left for us for so long. We actually want and deserve more. And we're going to hold you accountable and make sure that you give us more.
So well said. I really agree with that. And just the urgency, right, that is now here. I think it hasn't always been felt, but hopefully it's being felt now. So thank you so much, Shakir, for what you just shared. And that kind of takes me to my next question, which goes to Stephanie, who's here with us. I'm grateful to say you will have her audio. But Stephanie, discussions on policing surrounding police reform, they're often focused on the legislative piece of it, an incredible legislation like the Breathe Act, for example, but how those laws get implemented are just as important. And I would love to hear your thoughts on how, or just really about your role, right, in the justice system, and how can other publicly funded attorneys join in that fight against police brutality?
Thank you. So first, I have to say that, I am an elected Commonwealth attorney in the state of Virginia. That's my title, but before I'm a prosecutor, a Commonwealth attorney, I'm a Black woman. And I'm a mother of 4 Black children and a wife of a Black and Latino husband. And, I bring all of that with me to the work that I do. I'm never able to separate the trauma that my community has felt for as long as this system has been in existence. And so every day I grapple and struggle with being a part of a system that, quite frankly, has oppressed, that has been what it has been in place for, that has been the impact of it. And every day I do all the work that I can to undo those harms and to start restorative justice models going forward. And I say that to say, everybody who is in the position of DA, elected state's attorney, or anything of that nature, whether they're Black, brown, whatever they are, if they are not struggling, if they are not, realizing the detriment and the disservice that mass incarceration does, they're not right for us. They're not right for our country at this point, where we realize that we truly must decarcerate, that we must pull the resources from incarceration and invest them into community. And so when you talk about the Breathe Act and the movement for Black lives, which represent the voices of so many in our country who have done the work of realizing what we need to do in order to move away from the system of oppression and this racist system, it is my job to fight in any and every way possible to impact transformative change. And so for me, that has looked like lobbying with the General Assembly, that has looked like testifying before Congress at times, and that has even looked like in 2015, prosecuting a police officer in my city who killed an 18-year-old unarmed African-American young man, William Chapman II. And when I say, I prosecuted him, I don't mean my office did it, I mean I did it. I was first chair on that case. And led the trial, through a week-long jury trial, a year of pretrial motions, and ended up with a voluntary manslaughter conviction. And so I say that to say, this summer I saw a lot of hopelessness around our country. I saw people saying we can never get convictions, we can never get justice, but I know that's not true. If you have a fighter, a publicly funded fighter, meaning you serve the public, meaning you are not a Commonwealth attorney or a state's attorney to sit up on a pedestal, or to just be in power, you are there to serve the public. If you have a true public servant who will fight in any and every way, we can see the results that we need in order to hold the police accountable, hold ourselves accountable as law enforcement, as elected officials, as public servants, and, to do our best to see that transformative change. I'm done with talk about moving a needle. Incremental change is a failure. We cannot embrace or accept that because our lives depend on it. And so that is my simple answer, is that we must have elected leaders who are struggling with seeing the impact that, this system has had on communities of color and Black people. And I get asked that question all the time. Oh, as a Black woman prosecutor, how do you feel? I feel a struggle, an internal struggle every day, but that question should not be reserved for me and those who look like me. If you are here to do it the right way, we should all feel the internal struggle pushing us to try to work ourselves out of a job. Ideally, I would like to work myself out of the need to have a prosecutor. If we are truly investing in our communities and putting the resources in places to end food insecurity, to have adequate housing, to invest in education for our young people, to create opportunities for thriving in industry, and to build intergenerational wealth for our families, and to end this cycle of destruction that is mass incarceration. Then we will see a society in which we are not depending on the criminal legal system to address problems in a way that it never, ever, ever successfully addresses them. So I'm glad to and thankful to be a part of this conversation. But if you don't hear anything else from me, please hear that we can do this. We can see change and we can fight this fight. We just have to be willing to do so.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Wow, there's so many amazing truths that you just dropped in that. One, the idea of bringing your full self into every space that you inhabit. I don't think we can highlight the importance of that enough. I think it often gets minimized, and also that idea, like what it means to be a public servant. Like, what does it mean? Everyone is sort of expected, right, to rise to the occasion and fulfill that duty when they take on that role, regardless of what they look like. And so I thank you for your work and for your thorough response. And, based on what Stephanie just said, Hassan, that leads me to you and to your work. A lot of times conversations around policing in the US often centered around natural born citizens of the United States. But we kind of miss the fact that policing really has a lot of harmful impact on immigrant communities as well. Can you talk to us perhaps about some of that harm and why it's so important for us to include immigrant communities into this conversation?
Absolutely. And thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me onto this panel. I hope to be able to offer a modicum of help and assistance and knowledge and empowerment by talking about the effect that a lot of these policing or policies have on immigrant and aspiring American communities. The original sin here is a marriage that never should have taken place, and that is the marriage between the criminal and the immigration system. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about who actually engineered, this marriage and how it actually happened. We often talk about the system in an abstract sense. And part of my advocacy is uncovering who's actually behind it, like naming names and organizations and funders and people that have actually been working on this on these sort of policies for decades. I want to start out by just saying and noting that systems that intend to preserve and enhance the grip of white supremacy are, this goes back to the founding of our country, but nobody here listening should presume for a minute that the same organizations that are trying to hold police unaccountable, allowing police to act beyond the law, responsible for the system of mass incarceration, have not engineered a system for immigrant communities as well. It absolutely exists. When someone overstays a visa, overstays their status in the United States, it's not a crime, okay? Entering the United States without inspection is a crime on the books. It's a misdemeanor, on par with, here in Virginia, on par with driving without a license, or perhaps a reckless driving ticket. That's the level of crime that we're talking about here. But the consequences of doing so mean potential permanent banishment from an entire life that has been built by the aspiring American inside the United States. The congressman talked before about proportionality of punishment and how misguided the policies in the 1980s were about being tough on crime, 3 strikes, you're out, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we're talking about here minor crimes to non-existent crimes, things that are not even considered crimes under our criminal code, that are being prosecuted and punished as if they were criminal. But we hide behind terms like civil detention. We hide behind terms like family detention, when in fact, it is the meting out of criminal punishment without the corresponding constitutional safeguards. All right. You talk about an agency like ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who routinely terrorize immigrant communities and aspiring American communities to the point where even crime victims, victims of domestic violence, are afraid to call the police on a chance that they're going to be reported and deported for their reporting. Okay, this is not a system that is sustainable. It's not a system that will provide even a modicum of hope to aspiring American communities. And if you really want to see where the patriarchy will take this system, you can look at the immigration system, because this is where you can see the meting out of criminal punishment without corresponding safeguards. Let's take a look at these two systems here, criminal and immigration. In the criminal justice system, there's a right to a speedy trial, there's a right to a jury, there's a right to confront one's accuser, there's a right to counsel, right? In deportation proceedings, none of those protections apply. People can be held on civil detention for months, if not years. There is no right to counsel. You can get your own lawyer, but one will not be provided for you. These cases can drag on for years and leave entire families, in limbo. And I guess the fundamental point here is that there still is technically, at least under the law, a presumption of innocence until proven guilty. In removal proceedings or deportation proceedings, you're out of here unless you can show essentially beyond a reasonable doubt that you have a reason to stay. So what do you have when you have these two vastly different bodies of law coming together and married to one another? You get a giant mess. And if you want to be able to see where they'll actually take the system, look at the criminal justice, look at the immigration detention complex signed into law largely by President Clinton in 1996 with the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, which laid the groundwork for the entire deportation machine that has been honed, oiled, and operated by every president ever since. So it absolutely is a police accountability issue. It absolutely is a criminal justice issue. It absolutely is a racial justice issue, because immigrant communities are obviously largely Black and brown bodies. And I said before, and I'm going to try to wrap up with this because I've probably gone over time, and I apologize for that. But the system itself of how to engineer the laws to result in the apprehension, detention, and expulsion of as many Black and brown bodies as possible. I lay the blame at a number of groups: the Federation for American Immigration Reform, the Center for Immigration Studies, Numbers USA, all founded and nurtured by a white nationalist named John Tanton. These are groups which currently, or at least in the past administration, held considerable power and sway over immigration discourse. They were the ones behind SB 1070 in Arizona 10 years ago. They were the ones behind IRA in 1996. They have sued the Census Bureau in nearly every decennial census since 1980 to get that citizenship question put on. They were founded by a guy who took money, who believed in 1993 and actually wrote to a colleague that in order for the United States to maintain its national identity, it must remain a Euro-American majority, and a vast one at that. He thought Latinos were uneducable. He was a believer in eugenics. For those of you that might not be familiar, it's the race pseudoscience or pseudoscience, junk science that tries to prove that white people are genetically superior to members of other races. And took money from groups that actually modeled family planning programs on, get this, the Nazi government of Germany. So when I call these people Nazis, I'm not saying it lightly. I've got documentation to prove it. I'll stop there, but the reason why this absolutely is a racial immigration and the needs and requirements of the aspiring American community has to be included in this, because the patriarchy included them in their sights and married the criminal and immigration systems together when they never should have been brought together in the first place. So
Wow.
stop there.
No, thank you so much, Hassan, for just those facts are just very sobering. They're very, very sobering. But thank you for laying it out and making those connections, because I don't think we always see them, right? I think, and perhaps by design, right, that we don't always see those connections between the two. You know, my final question is for everyone on the panel, and that question is just, you know, taking in mind that over the last 9 months, there have been so many different policy proposals and ideas that have been thrown out. And I think that we can all agree that a return to whatever normal was prior to the Trump administration is not going to cut it. It's not enough, right? So for each of you, what would you say the next step should be? What policy, if you could implement one now, what would that be? And how can now and its members, how can they sort of join you in that fight? What should they be fighting for?
So I'll start. You know, I think one thing is to start to change the language we use. You know, people talk a lot about reforming this, reforming that, and reform oftentimes yields more of the same. And I think all of the panelists, myself, Stephanie, and Hassan, have all pointed to how we've been reforming for decades and we're still at the same point. And so we are actually, you know, working to present a vision of the future that is transformative, that is very different than what we have now, and that reorients our thinking around social problems in America. Because what we've done is, with the immigration system, with the criminal legal system, we have created structures of enforcement and oppression to continue, you know, sort of in the line of anti-Black racism and discrimination, to address, in many instances, what we believe are social problems, right? Or social breaks in the fabric of our country and breaks in the social contract that we have with individuals in this country. And that is true for everyone, no matter if you were born and raised in America or if you immigrated here, right? There is a social contract that has been broken, and has been broken especially with Black and brown people for decades and for generations. And so in 2019, the Leadership Conference, along with 120 other organizations, put forth Vision for Justice at 2020 and beyond, a new paradigm for public safety. And the concept behind that policy platform was really to take a holistic approach to transforming the criminal legal system, looking at it through an intersectional lens, looking at it in a comprehensive way, and talking about the ways that it needed to be you know, sort of changed soup to nuts, you know, from the top down or the bottom up. And that platform not only puts forth a set of policy recommendations, but it also sort of has us rethink the ways that we approach safety in America. And that is at the core, and I think the heart of many of the issues that both Hassan was talking about and that Stephanie and I, you know, sort of work on and talk about, right? We have viewed safety for too long through the lens of the criminal legal system, through police, through incarceration, through, you know, sort of enforcement, and not talked about safety in a manner in which we know sort of works and has worked for many, many years in certain communities in America. There are certain communities that are quote unquote safe, that don't experience policing and enforcement in the same way. And much of that is due to the types of investments that they have for very, very long have been getting on a regular basis, whether that's investments in education, equitable education, economic opportunity, the infrastructure in that community, the healthcare system. All of these things play a part in our part and parcel of creating safe and thriving communities in America. And the criminal legal system has been the place that we've tried to achieve safety, and it hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked because we know it was only about keeping Black and brown bodies subjugated and oppressed in this country as an extension of chattel slavery in America. So for us, Vision for Justice is the way forward. It's the way for us to think through the policies and practices that need to be in place, but also how we change and shift resources away from investments in criminalization and policing towards investments in every other aspect of American life that we know keep people healthy and safe and thriving. So what I would suggest is every, sort of member organization to look at that platform, to see, adopt those policy principles, and then to work in coalition to see those things put into place. The platform is comprehensive. It not only talks about federal policy change, but also has a state and local section. And so those of you who are working at the state and local level, I think it's very critical to not only, sort of find the groups of people that are like-minded with you and to move for transformative change at the state and local level, but then also leverage that work to the federal, right? Each and every one of us, except for me, because I'm a DC resident and we don't have DC statehood. So DC statehood, but everyone else who lives in a state that has representation in Congress, right? That person is there to represent your interests, and they listen to their constituents. So if you are working on, let's say, police accountability at the local level, it is important for you to weigh in with your member in the House, or weigh in with your senator around your priorities there. If you're working on pretrial justice and trying to decrease jail populations in this country, which are overrun in many instances with people who have needs, who have mental health needs, who have social economic needs that are not being met, and they're using the jail system as a place to house them. You should be talking not only at the state and local level to your elected leaders there to transform those, but also to work on federal changes that also influence the state. And so for us, there are a number of issues. I don't think there's one single issue. We are working on police accountability, pretrial justice, transforming the pretrial justice system, sentencing reform, eliminating mandatory minimums, looking at conditions of confinement and rethinking how our prisons operate in America. Vastly different models for that in other countries that are more humane, more dignified, more equitable. And finally, removing barriers for people who have reintegrated, who are coming back home, right? Because everybody's coming out of prison someday, except for those who unfortunately are on death row. And even then, we should be abolishing the death penalty, right? And pushing for this administration to, for once and for all, abolish the death penalty. So those are some of the key issues that we're prioritizing over the next 2 to 5 years. And I would invite all of you all to join in that fight with us, and also to see us as a resource in the work that you're doing at the state and local level to bring about transformation in a lasting and meaningful way.
Thank you so much, Zakir. I think you raised such good points. That thank you for sharing that resource that people can look into. But I also, you use the word investment, and I think that that's really key. I think when we're talking about safety, I'm just of the belief, right, that you invest in something that you value. And if you say that we value safety, then we need to invest in the things that actually help create safety. And you raised such an important bit about education and what those communities actually look like before the police show up, that would help create more safety. So thank you so much for raising that. I'm going to hear what Hassan and Stephanie have to say, but just so the audience knows, we are going to have a point to create room for conversation and to have your questions asked. So if you have a question that you would love to share with our panelists, please write it in the chat box, and we will do our very best to get to it. Know that we don't have a whole lot of time left to the panel, but we will try to get to as many questions as possible to really have a good balance and a good mix. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie and or Hassan, whoever wants to go first in answering the question.
Yeah, I will say, Sakira, she just stated it beautifully. This is so comprehensive. This is not simple, but it is nothing that we can afford to, wait around on, or again, accept that incremental change. It has to be transformative. And so all the pressure has to be applied to address the community investment going forward. But we also have to look at undoing the harms of the past. That's a very important conversation that has to be had about looking at the fact that Virginia, we don't have parole, and we don't have expungement. And so as we look at legalizing marijuana and creating an opportunity for industry, the very people who have been impacted by something that we're now saying should be legalized, they won't have that opportunity for industry. So once again, our community doesn't have the ability to build that intergenerational wealth and do things that other communities have been able to do. And so in short, I don't want to belabor the issue because again, Secura gave a very well-rounded response that reflects a lot of the same things that I lobby for and work on, but we must look back and undo the harms of the past, look at our state legislative measures to create an opportunity for us to do so, and at the federal level. And things like even student loan debt, those are things that impact Black women in a way that they don't impact other communities. And these are the people who are, oftentimes holding down families, holding down people who are incarcerated. And there are generations who have been impacted by mass incarceration. We need to be looking at the police officers in the school system, what impact that is having on our children, our Black children who are being harmed, who are being abused. And oftentimes, if you think about living in public housing, you see police in your neighborhood, you see them in your school. And what are we doing? What message are we sending? Are we preparing our young people for higher education? Are we preparing them for incarceration? And so looking at these harms that have gone on in the past that continue on a day-to-day basis, if we're talking about what we can do moving forward and we leave out the conversation about how to stop what's happening now and undo the harms of the past, then we're missing something. So I just, again, I'm very thankful for this discussion. But I want to make sure that we should never say, well, all right, we're going to look forward. With this new administration, we're moving forward. No, we're not there. We must look back too, and we must, ensure that we're doing everything that we can to address all harms, the past, the present, and the future.
I really don't think there's much else that I need to say that's it's been spoken so well and eloquently by my co-panelists here. Very briefly, I think getting a little bit down into the nitty-gritty, it's important to understand who the powers are that be, the powers that are actually perpetrating this entire system and have been perpetrating the systems that have kept Black and brown people down and subjugated for a long time. It's time to expose them, whether they wear a white pointed hood or whether they wear a suit and tie and roam the halls of Congress. It is important to expose them and purge them so that we can actually create a space to talk about rebuilding our system in a fair and a just and in a compassionate manner. It's also time for us to unite amongst ourselves. And I'm just going to say it, even though it's an uncomfortable topic, but in our immigrant communities, we need to get rid of anti-Black racism. We just have to get rid of it. It's something that I have seen, unfortunately, not only amongst different immigrant groups, but against Black people. And as long as that continues to be the case, all of marginalized communities are going to be continued to relegated to fighting for the crumbs that are left over from the haves, and will forever be, the have-nots. It's an unfortunate system. It's an unfortunate fact that we're going to have to get over. This is a book that I refer to quite some time, if anybody can see it, The Presumed Alliance by Professor Nicolas Baca, The Unspoken Conflict Between Latinos and Blacks and What It Means for America. Unpopular, uncomfortable book, right? But it is something that needs to be said, and it's something that needs to be dealt with. We have to prevent our diversity from descending into disorder. Only then will we realize the true benefit of the ideological and racial and cultural and religious and gender-based diversity that we have to build something greater than the sum of its parts. So I'll end with that, and happy to learn from the rest of you.
Oh, these are such good answers. Thank you. Thank you all so much for what you shared, whether it's from the investment to looking back and forward to kind of recognizing the importance of calling and exposing what's wrong that is existing within our communities and within the system before we can even change it. We can't change what we don't acknowledge, right? And I thank you all for highlighting those important facts. We do have some questions from the audience I'm going to share. For you, Jan Erickson asks the question, what are the chances of modifying qualified immunity at the federal level? Any thoughts on that?
So thank you for that question. As some of you may know, the House last year members in the House, Jerry Nadler, Representative Jerry Nadler, Representative Karen Bass, and led the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And that bill sort of took a stab at bringing about police accountability in a number of areas. One being eliminating qualified immunity, which is a doctrine that has allowed not only law enforcement, but public actors, actually, public sector employees to be shielded from any liability for violations of individuals' constitutional rights. In the bill, I said it takes a step because instead of eliminating qualified immunity, which is a judge-made doctrine, it's a judicial doctrine, there's no statute that gives them this shield from liability, but courts have done so. The bill only applies the sort of abolition of qualified immunity to law enforcement. So for many who have worked on this issue, Center for Constitutional Accountability, the ACLU, the fact that it is now enshrining into law a defense for other state actors to violations of constitutional, of individuals' constitutional rights, there is a concern right there. So there is a push to expand that provision to ensure that it once and for all abolishes qualified immunity and not just in the context of law enforcement, which is an important step forward, but it could go further. And so I think there's an uphill battle with respect to that. I mean, the fact is that, members of Congress, it's an issue that many people don't understand, and there's a lot of education that needs to be done. So we're actually working on that. There will be a briefing on the issue in the coming months, and I'll make sure that you all get that information about the briefing to share with your networks. But we're hopeful that there might be ways around addressing the issue of civil liability for state actors who violate individuals' constitutional rights. Some bipartisan support for taking that approach. So that's what I can say about it now. Not amazing news, but that's the update for right now.
Yeah, it's where we are, right? Thank you for that, Sakira. I want to jump to the next question, and it kind of hinges on what you're saying about the lack of education around qualified immunity and what that all means. And Dee Darling was asking, how do we quiet the scare tactics that the police unions are spreading, that passing legislation for police reform makes us less safe? And I think they often pull qualified immunity and the removal of it into that argument, that doing anything to reform the system would undo the system in a way that's harmful to everyone. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely have thoughts on that. We can see very clearly that we are not safe, especially if you're Black. You're not safe, and you're not safe from the system. And so that argument about, public safety, our communities are not made safer by mass incarceration. They're not made safer by incarcerating people who have addiction issues and mental health related issues, and, incarcerating children in school for behavioral issues that should be dealt with in the school. And so none of this behavior is making us safer now. Let's be very clear. And, again, it is resulting in death for Black people. So we have to continue to push against this status quo narrative that if we move away from what's happening, we won't be safe. Well, newsflash, we're not safe now. Our country was founded on violence. There has been nothing done for the past 400 years to address that violence. And, the only thing that we can do now is speak truth to power, that the statistics are there, that are very clear about what mass incarceration does to families and communities. And we know that we have not had a government that has invested in Black communities. And so if you want to have true safety, community safety, the goal is to invest. And we don't need more policing for that. Police are not behavioral health care specialists. They are not equipped to deal with these issues. And moving resources away from police is not going to do anything but put those resources in community. We don't have unlimited resources. And what are we valuing? Are we saying that we value, police being in communities and stopping people and all these things that, once again, aren't resulting in us being safe? Or do we value human life? Do we want to make sure that people are fed, housed, educated, and cared for? Because if we want community safety, that's what we have to do. We have to begin to invest in our people. So I get very frustrated when I hear we're not going to be safe. Well, we're not safe now. And I think that's what a lot of people have seen this summer. And with the rise in the ability to film, we see that body cams has not changed anything in terms of, the safety. It just puts everything on display. So that's a very dangerous argument for anyone to make, that removing resources from police or reducing the number of police in our schools or communities will keep us safe, because that is a part of the reason why we're not safe right now.
And if I can just
Go
add,
ahead, Shakir.
if I can just add to what Stephanie said, I think the other point, it's a red herring to suggest that accountability leads to less safety, right? I mean, if you think about any other profession, the medical profession, the legal profession, there are standards. There are standards that we must adhere to. Stephanie could be, any lawyer could be disbarred for violating certain ethical standards. They have to carry insurance in order, if there is a malpractice case, right? The same is true for doctors, right? You have to have there are certain standards that they must adhere to. So the idea that public servants, people that we pay, our tax dollars pay for, right, should not be held to high standards, especially when they have the ability to take life, sometimes with impunity, in many cases with impunity, that they should not be held to high standards, that they should not be held accountable for actions that violate someone's constitutional rights, that they should not be held accountable for discrimination, that the system should be sort of transformed, and they should not be moved away from engaging in traffic stops, engaging in sort of calls for service around mental health, engaging in certain things that they are not trained, they are not equipped, they don't have the expertise to do, would lead to less safety. Is just, as Stephanie said, it's a fallacy. And the data does not improve that. In fact, it disproves that, right? We have had more police in this country since the passage of the 1994 crime bill than we've ever had before. And that hasn't yielded a level of safety that any of us would say is correct. What it has done is that we've increased our incarceration rates. The 94 crime bill exploded mass incarceration in this country and built on the preceding acts, right, that Congressman Bobby Scott talked about in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, with the advent of the war on drugs and all of those policy changes. This is a history, right? This didn't just happen overnight. And for too long, we've said that police are the defenders of safety, when in fact that isn't true. Communities are. And they haven't yielded safety. And police show up to crime. They don't actually prevent it. They show up after you call and the harm has already been committed in many instances. So we have to really rethink and retrain our minds around this issue to think about, what's true and what isn't true.
Absolutely. And I think that goes, thank you, Stephanie, also for your thoughts. I think you both really highlighted this idea of, when we think about safety, it's like safety for who and safety from what, right? Because I think even just to your point, Shakir, about education, like when we talk about safety, some people are feeling safe, and if it's working for them, then it may not matter how it impacts other communities. And I think when we're going to have an honest conversation, we have to be honest about who needs to feel safe and what exactly do they need to feel safe from. And if we find out that it's white people need to feel safe from people of color, from immigrant communities, well, then the system works exactly as it should, doesn't it? Right. And so we sort of think about that language. And I love your substitution of the word qualified immunity for accountability, because that is exactly what it is. And I think most people at a gut level understand accountability. Qualified immunity sounds like a legal term that you don't need to understand or pay attention to, and it gets lost very quickly. So thank you both for just highlighting the importance of that. The last question that we have, it's not the last question we have. The last question we can get to with the time that we have is from Becca Fink. And she talks about being in Berkeley, and she says that her police chief there made a comment that monitoring white supremacy activity on social media is just something that they can't legally do. And they felt that that's something that should be done. Otherwise, it assumes that brutality against people of color is somewhat legal when you kind of use that framework that the chief seems to be using. So Becca wants to know, what suggestions can they take here in sort of addressing this in Berkeley and with their police chief. Anyone have thoughts on that?
I'll just briefly say, I will look at the patterns of the behavior and the conduct of that department. If they have surveilled quote unquote gangs or other community organizations in the past, as we know many police departments do, then that argument obviously is a fake one. So I would go and look at the history of what that department has done. Most departments do surveil, and there are even departments that have gang units. Like, here locally, there's a gang unit, and that's what they do. They look at social media and see what people are doing. And so I would, ask for, hopefully that is publicly available information. But if you run into a snag with the freedom of information, you might have a clue to the fact that yes, they actually are surveilling people, and that was just an answer that they gave you to shut you up. Just being straightforward. Once again, as Sakira said, it's about accountability. And if I know in California, there are a lot of prosecutors who have committed to holding law enforcement accountable. So maybe you can speak to the prosecutor in that jurisdiction and see if they have information about the previous conduct and whether or not there's an opportunity to look into that type of behavior. They have the authority to criminally charge if there is misconduct, and that qualified, I just put it in the chat, but that qualified immunity discussion does not stop prosecutors from holding police and law enforcement criminally accountable. And so if you find that there has been a misinformation, surveillance of one group and not of another, if you are in one of those jurisdictions with a prosecutor who has committed to transformation and police accountability, please go to your prosecutor and see if they can help you. And that is a part of holding them accountable to, keep to the word that they gave to the people when they said, we're going to do things a different way. I came around in 2015 before the quote unquote progressive prosecutor movement. And, I have seen a lot of people use it to say the things that sound really good. But now we are in a time where we absolutely need to see action, and we are to hold ourselves accountable as prosecutors, and the people are to hold us accountable to our word to ensure that we are seeing this transformative change.
And I'll just add really quickly. I know we're running low on time. That's not a can't. That's a won't. In response to that question, I mean, it's the way I see it. I'll give a brief example here in Virginia, in Culpeper County. I worked with a group called Muslim Advocates to file a FOIA against the police, with the police department in Culpeper County, Virginia, who had invited a notorious Islamophobe, a guy who goes around spreading conspiracy theories about how all Muslims are terrorists, et cetera, and was actually brought in and paid. They used taxpayer funds to pay this guy to come and train police officers in Culpeper County on understanding the threat of from international Islamic terrorism in this little county in Virginia. We FOIA'd it, and we got a whole bunch of documents, and literally we had this guy coming in and radicalizing the police officers by selling them onto this fiction of a civilizational jihad against between the West and the Muslim world. Okay, taxpayer money was being used to actually train these police officers to do this. So you never know what you're going to find if you get a good organization behind you and start utilizing FOIA offensively. Start utilizing the Freedom of Information Act strategically in places around the country. And again, sunlight is the best disinfectant. I've said it before. Expose them and purge them.
What a rich panel, you all. Thank you so much just for the practicality of your answers, but also just the depth. It's just, I could talk to you forever. So thank you all for all that you've shared. And I just thank all of you who've been participants in this and listening to this conversation. I really hope that you take the incredible advice and resources that have been shared by this panel and you use them. That's what we're fighting for. We're fighting to not just talk to each other, but then to do what we can with the information that we have in the spaces that we inhabit to bring about the change that's needed. So learn more about what's happening right there in your own community, and don't be afraid to ask questions. I think Sakira, Hassan, and Stephanie have all highlighted your right to ask questions and to be informed about what is happening with your money and in your name. So Thank you everyone who came today. We are going to take a brief break, about 10 minutes or so, just to regroup and get ready for our next panel, which will be discussing hidden bias in technology. So thank you again to our incredible panel, and I'm going to hand it back over to our now hosts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our third panel of the day. My name is Monique Alcala. I'm the Chief of Staff for Now, and I'll be moderating the next two panels, starting with our discussion on bias in tech. The internet has been a part of our lives for decades, and now more than ever, many of us are working and going to school working and going to school remotely. The internet is nearly inextricably linked with access to basic needs such as food, education, healthcare, and our social interactions. We're seeing social inequities that have plagued BIPOC communities for years replicated online through digital divide in the technologies we use. Today, we will discuss the reasons why online oppression matters, how it is manifested in our daily lives, and the implications for more accountability and building ethical technologies. First, I would like to introduce our distinguished speaker, Cecilia Munoz, Senior Advisor at New America. Cecilia is a national leader in public policy and public interest technology with nearly 3 decades of experience. She built a major initiative on public interest technology at New America and led locally focused initiatives. Previously, she served for 8 years on President Obama's senior team, first as the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, followed by 5 years as the Director of Domestic Policy. Before working in government, she spent 20 years at the National Council of La Raza, now Unidos US, the largest Hispanic policy and advocacy organization. In 2020, she published the award-winning More Than Ready, Be Strong and Be You, and Other Lessons for Women of Color on the Rise. Excellent book, by the way. It is my privilege to turn over the floor to Cecilia.
Hi, everybody. I'm so honored and excited to be part of your gathering today. And I'm really thrilled that you're focusing on bias in tech. It's a problem in all kinds of sectors, of course, but it takes on a special resonance in the tech sector because so much of our lives are driven by the devices we hold in our hands, the screens that many of us spend our workdays looking at, and the algorithms which determine everything from whose resume leads to an interview to whether or not you can rent an apartment. So there's already a lot of evidence that shows that when the pool of people designing the things that we rely on is limited, when their lived experience doesn't reflect the experience of the rest of us, what they produce will either be irrelevant or worse, it will be harmful. Small example, think about the news coming out of the pandemic that we're all living through. The pulse oximeters, those things you put on your finger to measure oxygen rates, which are hugely important right now, they don't measure very accurately on people with dark skin. That's a design problem, which if you had a dark-skinned person at the design table, would never have happened. I see this all the time in the policy world, which is the world that I come from. I also have a foot in the tech world through my work in public interest technology. And there are so many times in my career that I've been the only woman in the room, the only Latina in the room. It can take a lot of courage to speak out in that situation and to name the thing that you know that other people in the room may not understand. I've experienced this so much that I wrote a book about it. It's called More Than Ready, not just because women, especially women of color, are more than ready to be at those design tables, but because the world is more than ready for what we have to offer. So here's the biggest message coming out of the experience of my career and of writing this book. For those times when you may be the first woman in the room or the only person like you in the room, some of the other people in that room may make it clear to you that they have doubts about whether you belong there. That's happened to me more than once. They may cause you to doubt yourself. It's a really common experience, but we don't talk about it nearly enough. Here's what I want you to know. You belong in that room. Even if you're the first person like you to ever be there, you belong there. The people in the room with you may or may not understand that they need you there, but they do. They need what you know in order to make good decisions, to make sure that the next medical or tech innovation doesn't miss half of the population or cause some harm that you wouldn't have missed because you know what you know. Take confidence from that. Find strength in that. And be sure to surround yourself with people who cheer you on, who tell you the truth, and who remind you that your perspective is important. We're living in a time of enormous change. It's happening at a lightning pace. The world needs your participation and your leadership more than at any other time in our history. Be sure to be your own strongest ally. Thank you so much for including me in your gathering today. And thank you especially for the work that's still ahead of you. It couldn't be more important, and the rest of us couldn't need you more. Thanks, everybody.
Amazing. Thank you, Cecilia, for your valuable perspective. But that leads us right into our panel. First, I would like to introduce Jennifer Chang. Jennifer returned to school to pursue her master's degree in applied mathematics 16 years after she took her first calculus class in college. She's been working as a cybersecurity engineer since August 2014, and she's a Fulbright alumni and went to Denmark to study quantum cryptography in 2011. She holds the affiliate president position of the Women in Cybersecurity San Diego affiliate and is a Lean In Circle leader for San Diego Women in Tech. And next we have Leslie Miley. Leslie is a Silicon Valley native who held engineering leadership roles at Slack, Twitter, Apple, and executive roles at Google and the Obama Foundation. He has been featured in USA Today, TechCrunch, Disrupt, and Wired's Next List. He advises several startups founded by women and minorities and is an investor in a fund dedicated to diverse entrepreneurs. And third with us today is Camille Stewart. Camille is a celebrated attorney and recognized cybersecurity executive whose security programs have assured the safety of citizens, companies, and government agencies around the world. Prior to joining Google as a head of security and privacy policy, Stewart managed Deloitte's cyber risk practice. She was appointed to serve under the Obama administration as the senior policy advisor for cyber infrastructure and resilience policy at the Department of Homeland Security. She is also founder of the legal consultancy and startup incubator, Mark Law. Thank you all for being here today. My first question is going to be for Jennifer. So Jennifer, one of the topics that we want to tackle is the lack of diversity in tech. Why is it that the cybersecurity industry and the tech industry at large is so homogenous in terms of race and gender? What, in your view, are the challenges we face in STEM education in this country that prevent us from developing a more robust and diverse pipeline of tech professionals?
Thank you, Monique. First of all, I just want to say it's an honor to be here. I'm really glad that I be part of this channel. And I experience this homogeneous, every single day. And let me paint a picture for you, just to let you guys see how diverse is actually cybersecurity or the tech field is in my experience. And also from a recent study from ISC Square, which is an organization that issued a very prestigious and advanced, cybersecurity certification called CISSP. So a recent study that they put a women representation as 25%. And when you read the study a little bit in detail, you can tell that they even admit that the way that they did their study is like putting a higher number or percentage of women representation in the field. So, and in my opinion, or in my experience, I would say that I've never really experienced more than 20%, in my field. So I kind of like keep like an official tab, on how many men and women, in my teams, throughout my career. And it doesn't seem like that it go over 20%. And 11% has been, the figures for the past, like, I don't know how many years, 7 years. And that's why that I'm very passionate about and joining this Women in Cybersecurity organization. And what we want to do is try to move the needle. So now that I paint a picture for you and see how, the diversity is in cybersecurity and in the tech, in general. So I can say that the reason I can see that is because cybersecurity is actually traditionally from a IT field. So as you all know, IT is very male oriented, very computer science oriented as well. So the root of the problem is really in our science, computer science education, right, in our college. And it has been said that during the 70s, actually women are amazing during the 70s. We had Katherine Johnson, you have all these like amazing women that actually create, studying Fortran, which is a computer programming language that is like by a lot of mathematicians during that time, So during the 70s, the computer, the computer science, like really a lot of women into it. And in fact, you can tell a lot of women in their 50 and 60, they actually have a computer science degree back then. So it's not that, back then it's like, it's just for everyone. But then once the personal computer has been market as like towards men, towards boys, and then that you see the figure drop significantly. And I can say that from 70 from now, and I have seen a lot of, expert opinion or like statistics, we have not been recovering to that point. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the big reasons that we don't have enough people, right, feeding into that tech field. And also, think about who's on the chair of the science, computer science department, who's the dean of the college, right? Academic has its own problem with a lot of old school mentality, and it has been known women is really hard to get tenure position. For myself, I for once I want to be a computer scientist, but what discouraged me is just the whole package, why I want to go into the field. At the time, you just say, oh, you can make awesome software, you can make money. And everybody knows that women want more than that. You don't want to just make money and, you want to help, other people. You want to do something much more meaningful than that. So that's why I see the problem with it. And another problem I see throughout my careers, throughout my all the different companies, no matter where you move to, is always have this toxic masculinity culture in that environment, right? And as you were, Cecilia, I think is that her name, Cecilia was talking about, right? They were talking about that you're always the only woman in the group, and I have been almost always the only woman, in my team, and it's really hard to change the culture when the the whole group going out, to say, oh, let's go out for lunch together. You're the only woman in there. Everybody talking about golfing. Everybody talking about how good, the whiskey are and stuff. And this is not my culture, And on top of it, I'm a mom, and I stay at home, for a long time, and that's why I want to stretch that. I'm actually represent a lot of different, foster of the faces, of technology, because I'm also a return, with a career return to my career. What do you say? I have a big gap, 16 years gap, so to speak. So that's what I can see. That's a problem in there. And one more thing that I want to say about is like, yes, the culture is hard to change. Yes, there is academic problems, the STEM academic problem. We don't produce enough, we don't sell the field enough to the women. With the changing of the cybersecurity field, it's more holistic now. It's moving more away from the IT field. You do see that a lot of women is actually at the leadership position, which is really, I'm really glad to see that. But as far as like the everyday technical aspect, and I have so many stories that, I can probably talk all day about, the woman's experience, being on the team and not giving enough credit, and so on and so on. But one of the main things I want to say is like, there's always an enabler. There's always an enabler to enable that kind of culture and not, willing to change. So don't be that enabler. Don't be that enabler. Speak up. I speak up, but oftentimes nobody back me up. And they will tell me personally, in a private message, but I need you to speak up, in the group and back me up there. So that's all I would say.
Yeah, that's a great question, or that's a great answer. I do think that, building the pipeline is certainly very, very important, but we definitely need to have more accountability. And so that leads us to our next question, which is for Leslie. Certainly somebody who knows about accountability and speaking out about it. So one of the things that we definitely are lacking in Silicon Valley is accountability for top leadership, Leslie. So you've written about this in relation to Travis Kalanick's mishandling of sexual assault and harassment allegations over at Uber. So how do the attitudes of leadership at tech companies affect the culture and environment at those companies? And how do we create mechanisms to keep leadership accountable for things like racism and sexism at their companies?
That's a great question. And thank you. I want to thank the National Organization for Women for having me here. I want to thank everyone for joining. This is a great forum to have this conversation. I want to touch upon the previous question a little bit. It's like we ask, why don't we have more representation? Why is it's not more inclusive? And I really just come down to one reason. They're racist. They're sexist. There's really no other reason. We can make up other things, but at the end of the day, when you look at it, like, why don't you have women of color? Why don't you have Latinx? Why don't you have Black or brown people in your organization, in your leadership, on your boards? It really just comes down to one thing: you're racist. And you can play around the edges. You can say, well, no, I'm not. But at the end of the day, the results show that you're racist. So that's just how I look at it, and how I frame it, and how I speak about it. I'm not giving space for anyone to feel good about the performative work they do. If the impact is still, the organization looks the way it does, it's because you're racist, and you need to go do the work, and then you need to come back to the table and be open and willing to learn. Having said that, how do you hold people accountable? I mean, that is really good, and I don't think it's hard, but people need to have the will. You need to remove people who get in the way of this progress. It's that simple. They don't tie their compensation to it. You remove them. Because if you say, we're doing this and we're going to have this type of representation, and then you don't meet it, and you get to say that again the next year, and the next year and the next year and the next year, and nothing happens, that's not accountability. And now it's like, oh, we're going to tie pay to it. But when someone's getting $20, $30 million a year in total compensation, and you ding that by 100,000 or 500,000, yes, that's real money. But at the end of the day, it's not that much money for a lot of co-founders. And then I think you go one level up, and from just at the startup and the entrepreneurial space, and you have to start holding where people get their capital from accountable as well. And that's something that is just not happening. VCs, and I was just reading something on this the other day, almost every VC, with the exception of a few notable ones, made huge commitments after, in the last year, for racial justice, for equity, for inclusion, and then it's just been quiet since then. And there's no accountability. It's like you go back and ask them, and they say they're doing work, but once again, no one's being held accountable, no one's losing their job. And I find it ironic that the standards that people of color, and particularly women of color, get held to in tech, are so high and they're so hard, and yet, I'm going to be perfectly honest, white men get away with everything and do the minimum amount of performative D&I work and get promoted because of it. And that has to end as well. And I think, and I can name it. It happens at Facebook. It's happened at Twitter. It's happening at Google right now. It happened at Pinterest. It's happening at these companies. And we have to really start voting with what we have. And I tell people, someone asked me the other day, is like, well, what can Black people do to move the bar forward at a Google or a Pinterest or at a Facebook? And I said, stop asking Black people to solve your problem. What can really happen is that white people need to start voting with their feet. Our white allies, our people in privilege, need to start removing their labor from practice, because at the end of the day, all these companies that said they're going to do these things and nothing's happened, the only people that really can hold them accountable are the people who are providing their labor. I'll stop there because obviously I've had too much coffee, but thank you.
We all love coffee. I'm sure we can all relate. So thank you for that answer. And so that brings us to Camille. I'm really excited to have you on the panel today. And we know we've been talking about lack of diversity and accountability in the industry, which impacts not only people who work in it, but also people who use the technologies that the industry creates. So for example, there's not enough attention that's paid to how systemic racism has affected technology. And this is kind of a difficult idea to understand since we think of technology as being completely neutral and unbiased, or a lot of us do. And so can you explain how systemic racism has affected cybersecurity in the tech field?
Yeah, thank you for having me. We constantly discuss diversity and inclusion issues as a workforce issue. And yes, that is a huge piece of this, and it's a big part of the solution. But ignoring the impacts of systemic racism and our inability to talk about how race manifests itself in technology and policy and process is a gap in the efficacy of cybersecurity practitioners and a gap in our ability to effectively stand up trust and safety organizations that do content moderation and things like that. Why? Because how technology moves through communities, how people adopt technology, how a policy or program resonates with a different community or person is integral to completely understanding how much of a vulnerability, of a threat, of a abuse vector you've been able to mitigate. So let's think about like a WhatsApp. It is an encrypted messaging system that we all use in different ways, but when you think about how it moves through immigrant communities, it's a little bit different. That is your connection home. That's your connection to your mom, to your aunt, to your cousin. And so the way that COVID misinformation, because now this is a place where we have a lot of forwards and what amounts to a modern day chain letter, hits different when it's your auntie, right? Like, oh, auntie said I need to go boil these herbs and do whatever is going to cure my COVID. That's a real problem. That's an impact to people that probably wasn't envisioned when WhatsApp was set up. And even as it was continuing, until someone who understood how an immigrant community used forwards to express sentiment, used forwards to share information amongst family groups, and saw that that was a different mechanism in that community. And so information and content moderation might actually need to be something they thought about in this encrypted messaging space, right? And so it's about bias in implementation, bias in data, bias in operation. So even if you want to think that the technology isn't biased, if it is sitting in a system, institution, organization, culture, community that is rooted in systemic racism, systemic sexism, then those things manifest themselves in the operation, in the data that permeates it, and in the implementation. Also, how these things resonate with communities is different. So you've got a program that is designed to engage people to advance a security or privacy mechanism. The way that they trust the institution that has given them that guidance is different based on community. So its ability to resonate and impact behavior will be different. And if you are unwilling to engage on that, there's a huge problem. And as we think about the national and international effects, as we enter the world stage and think about how we're making investments in Africa and how China's making investments in Africa and what that means for digital infrastructure and how we're able to show up in multilateral bodies to set norms around cybersecurity or around how countries engage with each other. All of those things have impact. And then also minority communities are disproportionately impacted by cyber attacks, right? When critical infrastructure is attacked and it is all connected in some way, that low income community that isn't able to get back online as soon has a different experience around that loss of service than a more affluent community. And the resources to get back online are different. So understanding how systemic racism, systemic sexism impacts our work is actually an imperative as a cybersecurity practitioner, as a person that works in technology. That's why product inclusion is so important, but also even from these security mechanisms, from these trust and safety mechanisms, we need to be thinking about how race, gender play into the work that we do, or else we are not doing a service to our users.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Camille. Now, I actually want to bring everybody into this conversation about diversity, because another effect of the lack of diversity in the tech industry is that teams, I mean, like we've said already, they mainly consist of white, males building digital tools, and those systems have reflected their biases. So we've seen this type of stuff like play out in facial recognition technologies, for example, that don't recognize like darker skin colors and can't distinguish between the faces of people of color. So can everybody like kind of weigh in about other ways that racism and sexism like they affect technology itself and how that sort of operates, and then also offer like maybe some potential solutions for people to understand?
I can jump in with some solutions since I kind of outlined the impacts. One thing that I'm noticing about racism and sexism issues, but especially racism issues, is everyone has a heart for these issues, but we are very quick to separate ourselves from them. We feel like it's bigger than us, right? This is an organizational issue, a societal issue. Someone else has to do something. And it is imperative for folks to realize that they as individuals all have a role to play in eradicating systemic racism and in making our technology better, and to holding companies accountable, holding governments accountable. So to Leslie's earlier point about all the promises that are being made by these organizations, holding your leadership accountable, pushing them to live up to the commitments that they've made, giving platform to your colleagues in a meeting or on any stage that you have, supporting your colleague that's advocating for something, even if it is not your experience, talking and be willing to have uncomfortable conversations in venues that could advance an end. Those are all things that we as individuals can do, in addition to the things that all these companies and organizations and governments should be doing, right? Being willing to talk about race is a industry-wide, institution-wide thing that needs to happen, but we as individuals can start that and spark that. and be thinking about how these issues are manifesting themselves in our work. And if we are doing that at the individual level, it will drive the institutional and organizational work that needs to be done. And so, I mean, there are a lot of solutions to this. We need to change job descriptions to get more people in. We need to, you know, push governments to do more, et cetera. But I want to really pinpoint that there is a role for the individual and that you should feel empowered to do this. To Leslie's point, don't leave it only to the people who are adversely impacted to carry the mantle on this. There will be no progress if that is the way this moves forward. But you as an individual, whether you are the most junior person at your organization or the most senior person, have a sphere of influence, please use it.
I think there's so much to unpack there. I mean, I've been doing tech for over 20 years and I've never had a Black boss. I mean, just like, it just hasn't happened. And so inclusion and representation definitely matters. I think, you know, one thing I saw that disturbed me in the last year were all the organizations, companies coming out showing that, hey, we're going to donate to this, we're going to donate to this, we're going to support this, we're going to support this. And I didn't see anyone, and I don't recall, and maybe it's because I didn't read every press release, people saying, we have a lot of work to do internally. We have a lot of work to do internally to understand our biases, to understand you know, how we're here, and start on this journey of learning about it so that we can start correcting, fixing, removing, replacing these systems that are inherently biased and inherently discriminatory. I didn't see a lot of that. And I wondered, I'm like, a couple of things are going on here. We're getting a lot of white savior. I'm going to call it white savior. We're going to donate money. We're going to make a contribution here. Like, I don't want charity. I want investment, number one. And two, I want you to also invest in yourself and invest in the people around you to learn this. There is nothing more transformational on this journey than understanding the historical context around how our society, how our police, how our criminal justice system has been designed to keep, you know, people of color, you know, in a certain place. And when people don't understand that, you know, they can't internalize it and make proper product decisions. And I'll give you an example. You know, a company I'm working with, we were doing going to do a product for background checks, and I was like, hold on, let's talk about this, because there are inherent issues with background checks. And the organization didn't, you know, and even though I'm a leader in the organization and other people of color were leaders in the organization who brought this up, the product team just kind of went ahead and did it until it really came up in essentially in a company all hands, where it's like, this is a problem and here's why. Here's what the data says, here's what the data supports, here's what people said to you several months ago and you went ahead. Why did you continue going ahead? And at the end of the day, it was because they didn't fully understand that the police and the criminal justice system, you know, are biased and aligned and arrayed against communities of color. There's over-policing, there's corrupt police officers, there's, you know, the criminal justice system, which is a school to prison pipeline, right? There's all of that. They didn't get it. And once they started to understand that, they're like, oh yeah, we have to rethink this entire project. You know, but if people weren't in the room to say that and say it vociferously over and over again, this product would be out. It would be essentially weaponizing background checks against people of color. So that those are the things that have to happen. But it can't happen, and you can't put that work on the people who have experienced the trauma. It has to be the allies, has to be accomplices who have done their work and have educated themselves, so that when that comes up, they can be part of the conversation, not just a casual observer.
So let me give you a couple of examples of some of the biases in the tech. One of the things that I actually personal experience is the personality test. I don't know whether the company is still doing that in order to hire them. And I remember I was first came into this country 30 years ago, and then I applied some minimum wage job. And then I took the personality test. And I remember the result, you know, the hiring manager say, yeah, it's a little bit strange, you know? So, and then when I talked to some other, another colleague, she's from Russia, and she told me that, yeah, those personality tests never, you know, really represent who I am. So apparently, you know, that is a problem if a company are using personality tests to have hiring decision. It's not, again, you know, it's designed by the majority white man, and it's not going to be do any service for the minority or immigrant community. So that's one example. Another example, and I've seen a lot, is especially in the cybersecurity field too, job description. So what I will say about job description, that I don't know whether you guys like to watch. I love Wipeout. I don't know whether you guys like that show. The Wipeout is kind of like an obstacle course, and men and women need to go through it, and then a majority of the people are men on that. So the obstacle course is like built for upper body strength, which is not for women, right? So inherently, it's already biased in there. So that's what I see, that the analogy in there, that your job description is really for the men, who wrote them, who a lot of time that I've heard a couple of the HR person, oh, I don't really know the HR hiring manager, really need. I just go for the whatever description the company or standard description that they have on there. So again, and a lot of times cybersecurity is such a new field. And also women enter the workforce a little bit later than men. So if you are asking for 10 years of experience, if you're asking for extensive experience, it is already an inherent bias against a woman already. So I will really suggest you guys that, those descriptions, don't read in too much in it, just apply it. What do you get to lose, just do it. So that's like two of the examples that you can see, very, everybody experienced that. Well, the personal test, I don't know about it, but the job description is definitely inherent bias in there. So as a solution is just like Leslie was saying, you just got to speak up. As I was mentioning before, don't be that enabler. You need to again, I'm always the only woman, and I'm very vocal in my group, and I got into trouble. I speak my mind, I got into trouble. And as I say, a lot of people will tell me afterward, after the meeting, privately, oh yeah, I agree with you, oh yeah, I think, that guy is a jerk, or I think they're discriminating against you, I don't think he's a poet. Don't tell me privately, stand up for me, allies, be my true ally, and really speak up to that group. And I see a lot of time that, people are just like tolerating that kind of behavior, especially in the leadership. And that's why I say you need to get rid of the enabler, and don't be the enabler. You need to be able to speak, and support the woman. And like Camille was saying, that even this is not your field, even there's another woman. And I have been doing that as well. There was one of the women on my team, I don't know why, her supervisor was just like so negative about her. I'm just like, I go out of my way to support her, even that I'm not really in her field, but I'm just like, it's just not fair. I need to speak up. And of course it got me in trouble. Right. And I think a lot of time that people are really afraid to okay, I even have women tell me that I don't want to say anything because I don't want to lose my job, So you have to know. And so the company has to create a safe space for people to really, get their concern. And I don't want to disclose this company, but one of the company I work for is really good. They actually have created a committee, and they create a safe space for women, for minority, for Blacks, to voice their concern. So this community will bring, and anonymously, of course, and they will bring back their concern to the upper leadership. So they are the liaison. So you're not directly talk to your manager or directly talk to your CEO, but who, they probably won't even read your email message anyway. But you have created this committee, and they create this safe space for people to really voice their concern, for people that are really telling them their everyday, experience or how they experience it. And then this community will bring it back to the upper management, how the upper management, deal with it, and it's their issue. But at least we have an outlet. People feel safe to speak about, their concern. And a lot of time, as I say, a lot of the women, a lot of the minority, they're just afraid to speak because they don't want to lose their jobs.
Yeah, and that's a great set of answers there. So thank you all so much. We do have time for some questions from the audience. So I want to make sure that we get to those. So if you have any questions for our panelists while we have them here, please put them in the chat box and we will make sure to get to them. I know that there are a couple already in the queue, and just we'll hopefully get to as many as we can before our time is up. But we do have one question already that I'd like to pose to the group, and it comes from Stacey Croto. She's saying that the backlash to women and BIPOC being present and advancing in the workforce continues. Why do white people continue to believe life is a zero-sum game? Where is this learned? Exclamation point. So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in here.
Well, I can jump in here for a little bit. I think, and going back to the experience, white people and Black people and Asian people and a lot of minority and immigrant people, a stay-at-home mom, so to speak, and we all have a different perspective. So I think a lot of time that people are at that situation, they want to help, they don't know how to help. And then, or they have good intention. I see a lot of good intention and go back, because they don't really understand the problem and they don't really include other people to be on the committee or to consult other people, and they all only using their own viewpoint, right? So I see that the problem is twofold. One of them, the white or the allies, you have to outreach to those minority. You got to understand how they feel. You're not just using your own, perspective, because your experience is not their experience. You can never understand our experience. So with all the Black Lives Matter, expo, and I again, someone was telling me, well, everybody experience unfair, just like that. I'm just saying, no, you do not understand how the Black people experience this systemic, experience. Don't tell me that you know how I feel. And again, with the Chinese community right now, they're facing a lot of, violence attack, on the so-called China virus, But so, and again, you don't know. How you don't know why I am fear go out at one point of my life. I actually afraid to go out. I actually have a Chinese grocery bag that I do not want to go bring it with me to the American store. I mean, that is affecting my life. That is affecting my everyday life, how I live. And people in LA, you do not know that. You don't tell me you understand how we feel. No, you do not. So one thing you have to understand that well, white or people that at a a financial advantage situation, or rich, so to speak, rich people, you have the privilege. You don't have to worry about all this stuff, little stuff, and you don't have to go out. You're white. You go out. You don't get yelled. People get yelled at you that go back to your country. You don't experience that, So they have to really understand that perspective. And second of all, like, I think the minority like us, like me, like a lot of the Black communities, a lot of the Asian community, a lot of the moms, moms is a big group to get, discriminated against. You have to speak up again. It is hard. I know it is hard to speak up, but you have to show people that how you feel. You have to be genuine about your feeling, your experience, and tell people exactly what you want them to do. Don't just tell them the problem and think about the solution. Tell them, hey, that's what I want you to do. That's how I feel, and I think that's a solution to go back. And I think that in the past we just speak of problems too many times and without a proper solution. So get in the working group, get on a solution. But as a person of colors, as a mom, again, you should tell people, you should not be afraid. Again, if it's a safe environment, you need to tell people how you feel genuinely, and then tell them what you want them to do. That's my answer.
Great. Does anyone else want to weigh in, or we can go on to the next question?
I want to weigh in maybe a little bit. I think it's people getting, for lack of a better term, and maybe it's an overused term, being radicalized by their friends and their family, saying things, and I've heard this so much in my life, and it's the most ridiculous statement. It's like, well, I have a friend who didn't get a job because they had to give it to a minority. Mm-hmm. I'm like, if that were the case, the Black unemployment rate would not be where it is today. And I think people just take that and run with it. And when they see that people who don't look like them are being given any amount of attention, and The Economist did a great write-up on this a little while last year, which is every time there's been Black progress in the United States, there's been a white racist backlash. And they went through historically, from Black Wall Street being burnt down to the revolt by the enslaved, and just the overwhelming amount of response, the overwhelming amount of laws and violence that was subsequent to the revolts that were happening. And I'm just like, it's the same thing. It's like anytime you see people of color, particularly women, and it comes back to women of color advancing, there's this huge backlash against it. And then people go and they take that in their communities and they say, well, this Black woman or this Latinx woman or this, and that's where it comes from. So anytime there's like talk of leveling the playing field, talk of removing inequity, for some reason, white people immediately think they're losing something when they're not losing anything. They're just losing the advantage they've always had. And I get that can probably be scary. I'd like to experience it. I think it can be scary, but y'all got to get over that. You have to, because that's what equality is.
Okay. We do have a couple more questions, unless Camille wants to weigh in, but we do have one from Don de Pascal. Sorry if I messed up your name. People mess up my name all the time. Sorry. We're in the same club. A good number of companies are starting initiatives in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is this a good starting point for involvement of people in IT and other departments?
I say start where it feels comfortable, whether that's in your organization, starting your own initiative to fill a gap that you've identified, or things that are external. There's a lot of work to be done, I'm sure, where you sit at work, but also in the broader community, the tech community, the cyber community, whatever community. So I say invest where it's comfortable, be supportive always, even if you're not on the committee that's doing the thing at your office, support people, amplify the work, give voice to that effort, but start wherever it's comfortable.
Great.
I would like to weigh in a little bit on that issue as well, just making sure that, your company is not paying lip services. I've seen that a lot, they just say, hey, now we have a diversity committee now, we're good. And then they really not really including women. Oh, they might have one woman, they might have one Black woman. And then that is actually pushing put a lot of pressure on that single individual, that they are, seems like they are the representative, and then because all the other people are white and they are the only minority in the group, so they feel like that they are the only voice here. Don't do that. Make sure that you have multiple, the only experience is really hurting women, is really hurting minority. You have to get a diverse group in your community. So again, I'm a little bit nicer than Leslie, I guess. I'm just like, I want to say they're racist, but I do see a lot of people that have good intention, but go badly. So I give them the what do you call it, the question of the doubt. I can't remember what you say the term, but I give them some doubt. I give them some points, so to speak, but I do believe, in Leslie term, at the end of the day, you need to examine yourself, examine that whether your experience, you're projecting your experience on this too much and then become racist. Nobody like to be called racist. That's the other things too, I do believe that that's unconscious bias. Everybody have unconscious bias, and that's the main draw, on a lot of the issue is like, you don't even know you're biased. So you need to point it out. A lot of time that people are appreciated. Oh, I didn't even know that I say this, I didn't know that. So again, big things, don't pay lip service, have more minority, on your community, and don't just like check the box. Okay, that's it. Really put in the effort, really put in the resources, really put in the strategy. Changing the culture is the hardest part, I believe.
Yep.
So work on that.
I think to add to that is people have to be, and organizations have to be willing to do the uncomfortable work. This is uncomfortable work, and things have to be said, have to be brought up, have to be discussed. And if organizations are unwilling to do that or want to play it safe, their effectiveness is going to be extremely limited, and in some cases could actually cause harm. And I've seen that both, right? Where I've been at places where companies make these huge pronouncements and then nothing happens. And then people become very disillusioned. And oddly enough, the people who stand in opposition of inclusion become emboldened because they see that. And it's happening today in tech, and it happened in the last 4 years in this country, in case you did not notice. People became extremely emboldened by what had happened. So I think if you're going to have any input or impact or involvement in what's happening at your organization, think about what type of impact they're having. Think about if they're doing the things that are really uncomfortable, and also think about your own well-being, because a very close friend of mine said, asking people of color to do this work is like asking homeless people to solve homelessness. It's impossible for us to really do it on our own, and we can be part of it, but it shouldn't be put upon us to do. So I try to be honest, not to get involved in any of those initiatives. I'm here if people want to talk to me one-off, but I'm like, this is y'all's work. I'm not solving y'all's problems. I've done the work. I've put the time in. I'm here to help you on your journey, but I'm not here to help the organization on the journey, because I think y'all need to figure this one out yourself. I can be as a guide. You can come and talk to me, but I'm not getting involved in all of your programs, because there's always a performative part to it that I see that I just want to stay out of. But I do think that if you think your organization is doing good work and they're actually doing the hard work, get in where you fit in, get in where you're comfortable.
Just one more note. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, right? Part of being uncomfortable is that you're wading into waters that you are unsure about, issues that are new to you, or perspectives that are foreign to you. And so, as long as you approach this with integrity and with a honest and candid and genuine mindset towards advancing change, being an active part of it, not passive, like Jennifer was saying, and being ready to wade into the uncomfortable and drive others to wade into the uncomfortable, as Leslie said, you're doing the right thing, you're headed in the right direction, but be not afraid to make a mistake, because it will come. It happens for all of us too, right? And it is a part of the process. It is a learning opportunity and something that you should welcome as such, and also be ready to experience the range of emotions that come in doing this work. And so you've had this conversation with a bunch of people who displayed their commitment to these issues in different ways already, but the spectrum is even broader than that, right? You might encounter straight up anger and frustration. You might encounter sadness. You might encounter annoyance, a number of different things. All of those are well within their right to be experiencing and demonstrating. Don't let that be a deterrent to you either. Find people that you can have candid conversations with, continue to work at making things better, but don't let someone's anger, which is probably rooted in, to Jennifer's earlier point, a bunch of experiences that you have no idea, because they are carrying a weight that you do not see and experiences that you do not see, but don't let that deter you.
Fantastic. And I think that we are at time. I'm so sorry, everybody. I know that we can talk about this. This is really a topic that I've been following for a while. But thank you all for your insightful comments, and thank you all for this deep dive into an often overlooked area with tech and inequality. So we'll take a brief 5-minute break, and then we'll regroup for our final panel on rebuilding democracy. Thank you all for joining us for this panel.
It's just